Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith. Today is March the 26th, 2023, and we are here to talk about the world. Foreign policy, economics, world history. Who knows? It depends on what people ask us on this episode of Agent Smith.
Hello, how are you?
Pretty good. Pretty solid, you?
Can't complain. A little leftover pizza.
Nice. Is it the type that you told us about?
It was.
Nice.
Guilty as charged.
Yeah, for those who missed it last week, we discussed his regular go-to pizza, and you can get the build in the VOD from last week's episode, which is available on YouTube. Yeah, we're chilling. I just fielded the chat for some questions and topics that they would like hit today. It was a pretty chill, straightforward week for me. I try to put in a lot of stream hours because I'll be away next week. Gonna go visit lovely Trisha, and then I'll also get to play Stormgate again, which I'm stoked about.
Oh, that should be pretty fun.
Yeah. Yeah, one of the questions that we had, which it's kind of a serious question, but kind of a funny question, is, let me just quote it directly because it was pretty well written. Concerned viewer writes, Dear Agent Smith, how does the economy respond if one nation floods the market with final warnings, devaluing the final warning value of other countries? We were talking about China, and I was reading the final warnings wiki page of China, and they've issued close to 700 final warnings during the 20th century.
Yeah, they tend to be pretty forward in their warnings and their rhetoric generally.
Mm-hmm.
It's just kind of their style. Yeah, after a while, they kind of lose their meaning.
Yeah.
So it goes. Yeah, I wouldn't worry about it too much.
Yeah, because North Korea also likes to issue warnings. That's one of their favorite things.
Yeah, basically the same approach. Just kind of talk big. Try to make up for weakness relative to the counterparty.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we got onto that because Medvedev was issuing some warnings of we'll use tactical nukes because the International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin, which seems probably symbolic more than anything. Like, who's actually going to perform that arrest? And where would they do that?
Yeah. Yeah, nothing's going to come of that. Just more posturing in theater. It's not great that it involves nuclear threats. Ideally, we would have left that behind in the Cold War, but so it goes. 2020s.
There was something people were talking about Russia bringing tactical nukes to Belarus. Was that a thing?
Yeah, the Russian government announced that a couple days ago. I think it was Putin specifically who said that they were going to move tactical nuclear weapons into Belarus. And they did mention that they were not going to transfer them to Belarus or anything like that. They're just going to hold them there. So it's not clear exactly what they're going to do, but I think everybody just interprets it as saber rattling by Moscow. They just want to try to kind of throw around nuclear weapons a little bit to kind of get people riled up in the hope that it'll intimidate the West. But I think it's happened enough times now that it's probably not going to have much, if any, effect. Yeah, they're kind of running out of ideas, so they're getting a little repetitive and redundant in some of the strategies they're trying.
I did read a headline of something saying that a lot of the Russian infantry was not getting paid.
Kind of. I haven't heard anything specifically to that effect, but I have heard a lot of generic complaints, like across the board, on a range of issues that they've been having trouble with. So yeah, it wouldn't surprise me if there were issues with payment. The more specific complaint that I remember was that Russian troops are being merged into militia units controlled by the separatist republics in eastern Ukraine, and that some of those guys have actually not been given their military identification number or identification card, something like that. Basically, it's the information that you have to have in order to prove that you actually did serve and qualify for military benefits. And so the concern is that, if they do actually fight under these militias, then maybe they will not actually be counted as having fought in the Russian army and will be denied benefits after the fact. So there's been considerable discontent over that, obviously. A lot of people don't want to fight, but regardless, at the very least, they want to be able to walk away with the benefits, because that is one of the few upsides to serving at this point. So the prospect that the government may kind of, circumspectly kind of cheat them out of that definitely rankles people. But that's not quite the same thing as not getting paid. I haven't heard that yet. It doesn't mean it hasn't happened. It just means I haven't read about it. There's lots of things happening right now all over the world, and it's more than a little difficult to keep track of it all.
Someone in Twitch chat says Putin has the support of most countries in the world: South America, China, India, and the world. The world is not EU and the US. Oh.
Putin does not have the support of most of the world. That is a gross over exaggeration. It's true that most of the world doesn't support the West either, but really most of the world just doesn't care about the war in Ukraine. For them, it's a European conflict that only affects them peripherally. It affects them in so much as it influences food prices, fertilizer prices, things like that. But beyond that, they don't really have a dog in the fight, so to speak. And in that sense, they don't really appreciate being pressured by one or the other party involved in the conflict into trying to take a stance. It doesn't really matter to them. But I don't think the absence of support for the West in the conflict in Ukraine is indicative of support for Russia. That's a stretch. They're just not that invested.
While we're on it, has there been any development in the conflict, or is it kind of a steady state?
There's a little bit going on. We haven't actually talked about it in a while. So I do have something of a backlog, so we could go through that.
Well, let's get it while we're on it.
Okay, let me just get this. Trying to get some things organized here. Okay, I'll get to that later. All right, so Ukraine. So regarding logistics, I just had some notes, but I imagine people are most interested in the war generally. So we kind of already talked a little bit about Russian troops and some of the difficulties they're having. Some of the other items that I've seen them complain of. I think we talked about this the last time, so I don't want to be overly redundant, but it bears repeating that Russian logistics have not really improved significantly. So there are still shortages. And there are still a lot of issues with leadership, especially regarding things like communications, officers not being at the front, or even issuing orders at times. There are accounts of Russian soldiers just getting to the front and not really knowing what they're supposed to be doing. So just organizational type difficulties are still an issue. In general, the Russian army has been getting better as the conflict has gone along in that regard, but their current performance still leaves a lot to be desired in that sense. Let's see. So there's been a lot of talk about a potential spring offensive, both by Russia and Ukraine for that matter, but it's not entirely clear how that's going to shake out at this point. Russia did launch a winter offensive. I don't know how significant the offensive can be said to be at this point. It's not really generating, it has not generated significant gains for them. And I don't know if it's the main offensive for the first part of 2023, or if this was just sort of more of a spoiling offensive meant to kind of disrupt the Ukrainians and kind of keep them tied down while they built up forces for a larger spring offensive, for a larger offensive during the spring, rather. So that's a little unclear right now. From what I've been reading, it may be that this became the main effort over time. But again, it's kind of debatable. Regardless, the Russians have taken a lot of losses thus far. Bakhmut is the most famous battle that's been fought as part of this, and that was a battle that was being fought even before the winter offensive was launched. But of course, it remained like a major effort. The thing that really stood out regarding Bakhmut was the involvement of Wagner Group. They really kind of took the lead there as far as pushing the Ukrainians back. But in the past week, that's really kind of petered out. There's still action along the flanks of Bakhmut, and it may yet be the case that the Russians are able to surround the city, or at least threaten to surround the city, just because of advances made to the north and south of Bakhmut. But for now, the Wagner Group's frontal assaults and the fighting within the city seems to be reaching a denouement. And Prigozhin, the guy that runs Wagner Group, has kind of signaled over the past week that he's going to kind of start not withdrawing from the conflict. He's not going to get out completely, but he said he's going to start kind of reducing his involvement. So Wagner Group may not be a significant factor going forward. I'm sure they'll still be there, but I don't think Prigozhin is going to be quite so ambitious going forward, given how middling the results of his investment have been thus far. So the Battle of Bakhmut is ongoing. Part of the winter offensive saw a battle around Vuhledar, and I'm probably mispronouncing most of these names, so I'll just apologize here in advance.
Let's get a blanket apology.
yeah, nice blanket apology there. So Vuhledar, I believe, is southwest of Donetsk, which is the capital of the Donetsk People's Republic, or whatever that separatist republic is called. The capital, that city, Donetsk, was never far away from the front line. When the de facto ceasefire, the line of control between separatist-controlled territory and government-controlled territory kind of stabilized after 2014, Donetsk was like right on it. It was very close to that front line. And so there's been not inconsiderable fighting since the current iteration of the conflict, starting in 2022, started around Donetsk, mostly in the form of Russians trying to push through, but they haven't been able to make much ground. In so much as they've taken territory in Donetsk, it's mostly been because of flanking activity that they've done to the southwest, coming out of Crimea, and then also to the north, coming out of the area around Kharkiv. So that kind of pushed the Ukrainians away from those frontline positions in Donetsk that they've been fortifying since 2014. But they still control some of that territory that they've been fortifying. And more specifically, that's the area around Donetsk that's seeing a lot of fighting. So southwest of there, roughly, there's been a battle brewing around Vuhledar. And from what I've read, the Russians did make a substantive effort there, but were largely defeated. And the Ukrainians apparently inflicted some pretty decent losses there. So that's a pretty, not like a major victory per se. I don't know that any of these battles can be said to be like really decisive battles in the grand scheme of the war. But compared to some of the other defeats the Russians have had, Vuhledar is probably one of the bigger ones thus far. There was also intermittent fighting pretty much throughout the front line along Zaporizhia Oblast, however that's pronounced, in the south of Ukraine, but that seems to have been much less of a focus for the Russians, and they haven't been able to make anything more than minimal gains up till now. And then further north, there's been fighting, I should say the northeast. There's not any fighting in the actual north of Ukraine anymore, but in the northeastern part of Ukraine, near a town called Kreminna, there's been substantive fighting. Supposedly, there's one account from a local Ukrainian, basically governor or politician, who said that the Russians had actually used T-90s up around Crimea, which was significant because we hadn't really seen many of them up till now.
T-90s?
T-90s are one of the more modern tanks, probably the most modern operational tank that the Russian army uses. I think development started like in the mid-late 80s or so, around there. And production was never really that great because, in the 90s, the Russians had a lot of issues with, revenue, funding, whatnot. But they did produce some, and they were supposed to be like some of the best tanks they had. They've been developing some newer ones, the T-14 Armada, probably the best known. Certainly the most well publicized. But it's not clear if those are actually operational yet or if those are still more in the prototype phase. That's kind of debatable. The Russian government has kind of made it sound like the T-14 is like ready to go, but then it was noted that they were missing after the start of the war in February last year, and nobody's really seen them. So it's not clear if that's an actual tank, an actual real tank that they have in their inventory. But we did know that they had T-90s. Mm-hmm. Not very many, but they did have them. And supposedly they used them recently in the fighting around Crimea. And if the account from this Ukrainian politician is to be believed, and of course that's highly debatable because obviously he has a bias, but he was saying that the Russians ran out of T-90s in the offensive around Crimea after about 2 weeks, and that they had switched over to using T-72s. So if that's accurate, that suggests that the Russians did finally use T-90s, but they did not have enough to survive attrition, which is what you would expect. Like you would expect a certain amount of attrition, especially in Ukraine right now, which seems to have a fairly high level of attrition for both sides. So good tanks are great, more survivable, more capable, whatnot. But in a battle of attrition, they're probably just going to eat losses like any other kind of tank. That was actually one of the points made by an analyst named Michael Kaufman in a video I saw on YouTube last week. He was being interviewed about the war in Ukraine, what the current status quo is, and et cetera. And one of the points he made is that, it's really more of a numbers game right now, not necessarily about quality so much. It's really an old school industrial war at this point. And in that kind of war, what matters most is who can outproduce the opponent, in terms of quantitative advantage, in terms of human resources, the actual soldiers, and then material advantage in terms of equipment. That's, the quality of the equipment does count. It does have an impact, but if you're sacrificing quantity at the expense of quality, you're probably hurting yourself. So that's kind of where we are, and that's why sending in the T-90s was maybe not the best idea, maybe not the best use of those resources. It probably would have been better just to go with some of the lower quality stuff. So the fact that they used them could actually indicate that they're really hurting for tanks. It may not have been that they really wanted to use them, but maybe they just felt that they didn't have any choice for lack of alternative. But it could also be that they were just hoping to make a significant breakthrough using some of their better equipment, and it just didn't work out. So, anybody's guess right now. Obviously, I'm not. Actually, this would be a really good time for the usual disclaimer. I'm not an expert in everything I talk about on here, including this subject. So if I ever say anything wrong, stupid, or biased, please do tell me. If I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. Participation by chat is encouraged in that regard, and I do like learning from chat and getting feedback and whatnot. So do kind of chip in that regard. I won't see it while we do this. I generally try to focus on the commentary and whatnot, but I will go through chat afterwards and get all of that feedback that way.
Yeah, tonight's Agent Smith, he says, as in StarCraft, in war, more stuff beats less stuff, and whoever can make more stuff has a distinct advantage.
Yeah, basically. But these were basically the four focal points that I noted when I was reading one of the reports from the Institute of the Study of War, which is the main think tank, I think, that is producing the main commentary on the war at this point in the West. Whenever I read in the BBC about the state of the war or the war in Ukraine generally, almost invariably the reporters end up referencing the Institute for the Study of War and one of their reports. And they do daily reports, just to kind of update people on the newest developments. So it is probably one of the best sources in English that you can get that does not involve people just directly involved in the conflict. So a recommendation there for people interested. If you really want like the top-notch primary sources, you basically have to get into like Russian or Ukrainian language sources, which are generally military bloggers or whatnot on Telegram. But if you don't speak Russian or Ukrainian, that's kind of hard to use. You may not understand much. You won't get a lot of the context of the videos you're watching. But yeah, those are the four focal points thus far. Again, the fighting is kind of dying down a little bit recently. It seems like the Russian offensive is kind of mostly spent at this point. And so the debate not the debate, but the commentary I was reading is that there's an open question about, one, whether or not the Russians are finished or whether or not they're going to try something else. And then two, whether or not the Ukrainians are going to launch a counteroffensive. And a spring Ukrainian counteroffensive has been expected, for a while, for some months. That's been the subject of considerable commentary itself. But nobody knows exactly. And of course, the Ukrainian government isn't going to tell. Right? They're not going to be specific about when they're going to do it or if they're going to do it and where they're going to do it. So it's pure speculation at this point. One of the things I did hear from Michael Kaufman during his interview is that he expects any kind of Ukrainian offensive to not be like a major focused offensive in one part of the front that's going to seek a major breakthrough. He was saying that it was more likely that if there was an offensive, it would be a broad-based offensive all along different parts of the front that were focused on key points of weakness that the Ukrainians had identified in Russian defensive positions. So in that sense, even if they do launch a major counteroffensive, it's probably not going to be decisive. It's not going to be like a big dramatic thing where they bust through the Russian front line and then do operational maneuvers in their rear or anything. It's probably going to be a slow incremental offensive that'll make little gains here and there over time. And the comparison that he made was to Ukrainian operations in Kherson Oblast late last year, in which they did not launch a major offensive into the oblast, in any one particular area, but rather just kind of applied pressure over time to try to push the Russians out. There were some pushes made. It wasn't just entirely opportunistic, but none of them were just especially concentrated in nature. So that's more what he's expecting from the Ukrainians here in the spring. And, it's anybody's guess exactly what they do. Again, it's all speculation, but these are some of the better sources that I have on the conflict thus far. And so that's the best guess that I can offer as far as what's going to happen over the next couple months. So overall, good news if you're pro-Ukrainian anyway. In general, there has been a successful effort to deflect most of the pressure that the Russian army has brought to bear since the December offensive started. But beyond that, it's unclear the degree to which they'll be able to take advantage of that, or the course that they're going to take as far as the upcoming year. The course of the fighting over the next year is basically a big question mark. And I don't think anybody expects it to end decisively this year. It's almost certainly going to drag into the next year and possibly even well beyond that. One of the little statistics that I've seen kind of bandied around some of the articles I've been reading was that most wars, specifically modern wars, have only lasted a few months. And of those that lasted longer than a few months, most of them lasted like around 10 years. Hopefully the war in Ukraine doesn't last that long, but there is some growing suspicion that this may be a very long-term conflict that could wax and wane with time as well. The expectation isn't necessarily that the fighting will continue as is for 10 years. Rather, what you could see is maybe little ceasefires or little pauses here and there over 10 years, but that cumulatively kind of come together to represent just little breaks in what will be an overall 10-year conflict. But that's also speculation. It's anybody's guess. just how things play out. It could be that politically one or the other faction, and well, not faction, but it could be that politically one or the other state loses support and ends up having to fold, or maybe is unable to acquire sufficient foreign support in order to continue the war effort, or there's some kind of economic issue that hobbles them, or maybe even that there's just some random negative externality that hobbles them. We've had no shortage of those around the world over the past couple of years, so that factor also cannot be ruled out.
Like, for example, alien invasions that wipe out the majority of the human population. I wanted to congratulate you, Agent Smith, and all of our viewers. Last week we did talk about a alien invasion that was supposed to happen on the 25th, and it was going to wipe out all but 8,000 humans. So if you survived, good job. Wishing you all the best.
Well done, all.
Yep.
You were the strongest of the strong. Well, let's see. Other than that, some just other notes here. There was a Russian mill blogger that was saying that Spetsnaz forces in Ukraine were having trouble with desertions. Pretty much no way to prove that. It's just like one blogger, and who knows. It is a Russian mill blogger, so those guys are pretty pro-war. So I don't know that they would post that spuriously. But again, without any way to prove it, it's hard to say. But it is notable in so much as Spetsnaz forces are some of the best that Russia has to offer. Spetsnaz is Russian special forces. So if they are having trouble with desertions, that does suggest that there's a greater level of discontent within the Russian armed forces than perhaps we had known. So that's something to keep an eye on. It could totally just be false, but given the broader problems that the Russian army has had with the morale of its troops, it's worth keeping an eye on how some of their elite troops are doing in that regard. Let's see, I did see in a video there was a reference to drones, specifically Chinese drones that were being used by the Ukrainians. There's kind of been persistent rumors that the Chinese are transferring information from the drones that the Ukrainians are using and giving them to the Russians. And this is something supposedly being done by DJI, which is the principal drone manufacturer in China, which has provided drones for both the Russians and the Ukrainians in the conflict. And, there's some evidence for this. There are some Ukrainian reports that when their drones come back to base, come back to their crews, that they're almost immediately then shelled with very accurate, ranged fires. And their suspicion is that the Russians were able to find them by tracking the drones somehow. And so, again, this is difficult to prove, but the Ukrainians, for their part, have been actively trying to find alternatives to Chinese drones in order to kind of avoid this problem. Let's see, there was a Ukrainian strike at a rail junction. Supposedly, they blew up a train load of Caliber cruise missiles. So if that's an accurate report, that's a pretty big win for them. The Russians have limited manufacturing capacity in order to produce those. They can produce more, but the pace is not high enough, not nearly high enough to meet the demand of the Russian armed forces. So any kind of successful effort to destroy their inventory is going to have a pretty significant effect on operations, or at least on the usage of those cruise missiles, obviously. Thus far, they've been firing them in volleys, generally in response to this, that, or the other perceived affront by, the Ukrainian government or the West generally. So, if they can reduce those inventories, they can kind of reduce the incidence and severity of those volleys when they do happen. Let's see, that's about all I had on the actual fighting. Well, I guess there was a little more. There was a Ukrainian drone strike. Where was that? Kolomna district, about 100 kilometers from Moscow. This is southwestern Russia. Supposedly, the Russians shot down a Ukrainian drone. Possibly 3. They claimed 2 others, but I think there was only visual evidence of the one thus far. And it's not clear what the drones were doing or what their target was, or etc. But in so much as the Ukrainians can be shown to have been operating drones over actual Russian territory. It seems like that's going to be a consistent thing going forward. Yeah, this is kind of a touchy area for the West, because in general, the United States has been requesting, not necessarily telling, but requesting that the Ukrainian government refrain from engaging in operations in Russian territory. Yeah, well, we don't really want them to use the weapons that we're giving them on Russia itself, for fear that Russia may then take that as an excuse to escalate and perhaps start going after the supply chain of Western equipment into Ukraine more directly than what they have been. And also, there's always the risk of, nuclear escalation or an out-of-control tit-for-tat series of escalations, which we've talked about before. So in order to mitigate the risk of that, the West, and the United States in particular, has requested the Ukrainian government limit its operations in Russia specifically. Certainly, we've requested them not use weapons that we've supplied to them on targets in Russian territory. There is one caveat. We seem to be okay with them going after targets in Crimea, given that that's still technically disputed territory. But in actual undisputed Russian territory, we're a little more uneasy about that. And the result has been that the Ukrainian government has been very cagey about its involvement in operations in Russia. It seems pretty clear they are doing it. But I've also read that they haven't been entirely forthright about their involvement, even with Western allies, over the course of the war, just because the West is so kind of iffy about it. So there's been a series of operations in this vein. The destruction of Nord Stream, the Nord Stream pipeline last year. Ukrainian involvement was never proven in that, but it was always kind of suspected. There was a lot of different suspects. The Ukrainian government was just one among them. But then there was a New York Times piece recently that suggested that, not suggested, they said that sources, undisclosed sources in the US government, had said that there was new intelligence on who had been responsible. And thus far, the Ukrainian government has not been implicated, supposedly, by that evidence. But the group that is suspected to have been involved in the destruction of the pipeline was a pro-Ukrainian group of some kind. It may have involved Ukrainians, it may have even involved Russians. It's just not entirely clear. Again, the source was very cagey about the details. So it's still not exactly known who was responsible, but it seems like there was some kind of pro-Ukrainian group comprised of people of undisclosed background who were responsible for blowing it up. So hypothetically, it could still yet be proven that that group was supported by the Ukrainian government somehow, to some degree. That could be an issue. I don't think Germany would much appreciate Ukraine blowing up the pipeline like that, but who's to say? So regardless of who was responsible, I think even if it's found that Ukraine is found responsible, probably Western governments will be pretty cagey about that, even if certain governments in Europe would not have liked it. But that's one example of the kind of operation that Ukraine may or may not have been involved in, that the West is a little uneasy about. Apparently, the truck bombing of the Kerch Strait Bridge was another one. Apparently, they did that more on their own initiative than they did in conjunction with the West. And there was also a drone strike on a Russian airbase in southwestern Ukraine, in which they went after some Russian bombers, supposedly that had been launching cruise missiles as part of one of those, volleys that I mentioned. So yeah, they've been doing it. They've been pretty active. Well, maybe not very active, but they've been active. So it seems like this is just going to be an ongoing, awkward area between all parties involved. You can't blame the Ukrainians for wanting to hit targets within Russia. I mean, it makes a lot of sense, especially in so much as they go after logistical targets. But I don't think it's something they're ever going to be able to be completely open about, given concerns in the West about escalation.
Yeah, I think one of the important chips on the board for the West and their support of Ukraine is they want to make sure Ukraine has the moral high ground. So they need to, as much as you can do so, conduct the war operations in a more defensive
Yeah.
their sovereignty first capacity, as opposed to like an all-out, well, okay, now we're just going to attack them full on, because that changes the tone of the conflict quite a bit. But it is like, it makes it doubly complicated for Russia if Ukraine does attack them as well, because they have to focus on not just their offensive operations, but also making sure that their defense over the line is also secure.
See, that's an interesting point that I would actually disagree with. Because if Ukraine did fully retaliate, like tit for tat, then they would be launching volleys against civilian targets in Russia. And that would actually be a benefit to Moscow, because then they could paint the war as being a war as one against, Nazis, authoritarians, just violent people who hate ethnic Russians, etc. It plays into their narrative effectively. So, if Ukraine did start really going after targets in Russia, be they military or civilian, Moscow would not be entirely averse to that. You're right that they would have to defend military targets more, but I suspect that they would not really defend civilian targets that much, since that would be very useful to them. And the Russian government historically does not have like a great track record, of protecting civilian populations. I was watching a YouTube video about the siege of Leningrad recently, and the Germans were of course principally responsible, but the Soviets apparently did not plan very well in advance of it. So there was some culpability there. Regardless, the Ukrainians are not going to do that, because the West basically would find it difficult to continue to justify political support if the Ukrainian government lost, to whatever degree, the moral high ground in the conflict, as you say. So I would definitely agree with that. So I don't think they'll do that. But they will continue to hit targets intermittently, probably more the high value targets, as they judge them. It's worth pointing out here that they may have been involved in at least one assassination attempt in Russia. And apparently the Western response was sufficient to kind of deter them from further efforts. There's a philosopher in Russia, I think his name is Drugin or some such. I forget his name off the top of my head, but he's kind of known as a Eurasianist. He believes that Eurasia is sort of destined to be a part of the Russian sphere of influence, and is its own civilization, and should and will be a major power in the world. And there was an attempt to kill him. There was a bomb placed in his car. He actually was not hurt.
That was hurt.
Yeah, that's what it was. He was not hurt, but his daughter was killed in the explosion when his car was destroyed by the car bomb. And it was actually sheer chance, as I recall, that he was not in the car when it went off. Like, it was just, he was going to go somewhere with his daughter, but then he changed his mind and wanted to go somewhere else. And so when the bomb went off, it only killed her. So Ukrainian culpability for that attempt has not really been established. It's not clear who was responsible. But the Ukrainians have definitely come under suspicion for that. And apparently the West, specifically the US government, kind of approached them and said, hey, we don't know if you did this or not, but we just want you to know that if you are engaging in these kinds of activities, it will have a negative impact on our relationship and the prospects for future support. And since then, there have been no further such attacks within Russia. So make of that what you will, but regardless, if Ukraine was involved in that, that would be an example of the kind of activity that would definitely undermine their claim to the moral high ground in the conflict, and by extension would undermine the degree of support they would have in the West.
Yeah, it's interesting that the West is kind of holding them accountable in a way that a lot of times in war, I don't think that sort of pressure point is applied. It's like, we want you to win, but we want you to win in a certain way. I don't want you to resort to dirty tactics.
Well, it's not entirely out of altruism, right? A lot of that is just political, because there is no inherent reason that the West needs to support and supply Ukraine, right? Like, hypothetically, I mean, keep in mind, the expectation at the beginning of the conflict is that the Russians would just steamroll them. I talked about that for years. I even remember talking about it like back in whenever 2017, 2018, when we were doing this. And I was saying I didn't really entirely understand why the Russians just didn't invade, since the West had sent every signal that they would just roll over. And I kind of suspect that's what the West was planning to do this time. And the only reason we didn't is because the Ukrainians actually ended up successfully fighting off the invasion and turning it into an actual war instead of a cakewalk for Moscow. Lost my train of thought. Where was I going with that?
We were talking about the political side of the West not
Oh,
wanting...
right, political side. Yeah, so that was the expectation, that they would just win. So the West, has the West has no inherent reason to support Ukraine. Like, hypothetically, we would be okay if we just stayed out of the conflict. Because Russia probably, I have to say, would not go further than Ukraine, although really it's anybody's guess, given how irrational the invasion was, just how bad the planning was and the expectations on the part of Moscow. There's no telling really what they have planned at this point. But regardless, we could hypothetically just stay out and it wouldn't be too big a deal for European security. So what that means is that the option to leave is always there. And so in order to ensure that Western support continues to flow with the regularity and scope that is needed for Ukraine to stay in the conflict and eventually win, then the political support, that is to say, the popular support of Western body politics, has to be maintained. And given that governments in the West, the United States, Britain, etc., all consider it a priority to keep Ukraine in the conflict and continue to supply them, now that is our position, they see the maintenance of public opinion as key. And that's why they focus on that. If not for that, it would not be as much of an issue. Like if support of Ukraine was seen as like a key national security interest, that was like a real necessity for the defense of the United States and European security, there would probably be much fewer qualms about Ukrainian activity within Russia. But as is, the political theater aspect of the conflict is important because of the fact it is more optional than mandatory.
Yeah, we'll see where it goes. This whole ordeal has had us wrong on a lot of predictions, so...
Well, not just us. I mean, the stuff I was talking about back in the day was pretty much the consensus opinion amongst most analysts. Mm-hmm. So there's a whole broader constellation of intelligence agencies and analysts and think tanks that were also proven wrong and have had to adjust since then. Mm-hmm. So join the club. It's a big one. As far as Ukrainian activity in Russia, I did have another note here that I thought was interesting. I think we might have mentioned this last time, but it had to do with some kind of volunteer group, some kind of militia or other militant group that raided Bryansk, or maybe Bryansk. I'm not sure how to pronounce it, but that's a province of Russia, an oblast in southwestern Russia, that supposedly was raided by these guys. It's not entirely clear exactly what they did. Supposedly, they ran in, fired on a car full of civilians. That's the Russian account. And it supposedly also took some hostages before being shelled and eventually pushed out of Russian territory. Now, again, that's the Russian account. We don't really have an alternative account, which is notable. The Ukrainians have not said that they're responsible or even recognized the incident in question. The only other account we have is from the group itself, the Russian Volunteer Corps, as they call themselves. They say that they, quote, entered Bryansk region to show our compatriots that there is hope, that free Russians carrying arms can fight the regime, end quote. So that suggests that there was, in fact, some kind of raid, but we have very few details about it. It may be that this is the kind of thing that the Russian government is actually more worried about than, Ukrainian military activity. Because if the Ukrainian military strikes targets in Russia, then that's just part of the war. And if they hit, civilian targets or something, that's even helpful to the Russian political narrative. But if there are actual Russians fighting with the Ukrainians and actually moving into Russia itself to try to undermine the regime, that poses a more significant political threat to the government. So again, this is all speculation. We don't know if this is like an actual group of Russians or if maybe it's just Ukrainians pretending to be Russians. We don't know if they're being supported by the Ukrainian government and working at their behest, or if it's just an independent militia that is acting on their own initiative. All of that is an open question, anybody's guess. They've only conducted one raid that we know of. It may be that Kiev basically cracks down and asks them to stop because it doesn't like the idea of a group operating outside of its bounds, or maybe the West put pressure on them to stop, in so much as they may have been controlled by Kiev. It hasn't happened since, anyway, is what I'm saying. If it does happen again, that'll kind of bring this back to the fore, and we'll probably learn more about it. But for now, it's just like this weird anomaly that's unexplained. But kind of keep an eye on that space. It could be that there are more Russian militant groups that emerge, either backed by Kiev or not, that start going after targets in Russia.
Yeah, as with any conflict, there are bound to be some people who are against the conflict, even on the Russian citizen side of things, and just to have low faith in the government overall. But yeah, the control of information, I think we've talked about that as being one of Putin's strengths as a leader, is just manipulating perceptions and stuff, and how for the past few decades they've really kind of made Russia out to look like a superpower, and that he's a badass and he rides a bear into battle and all this kind of silly macho strongman leader stuff. But the actual setup there might not be quite as strong, but the perception of it has a lot of value on its own. I think some of that also keeps the population in check. Like if they're afraid of the regime, then they're less likely to stand against it. But if they see the regime not doing too well with the war, that can be a sign for them. They're like, hey, maybe it's not as strong as we thought it was, and we can do something about it. It just seems really hard from their perspective, and it's hard to imagine as someone from our station of, we can choose between political parties and we kind of have the cycling back and forth of power between one and the other. But if you're in a country like Russia or like China, you're kind of stuck with the one just indefinitely, unless something really weird happens, which is going to be rare.
Yeah, it doesn't leave very many avenues for nonviolent political opposition. Although there is still some of that. Kind of gets underplayed a little bit because it hasn't been very impactful, but there are still protesters, kind of protesting against the government, trying to signal their displeasure. And there has been periodic sabotage within Russia, although it's not entirely clear who's responsible. Yeah, it may be that that's another example of Ukrainian activity in Russia. But they're very, very cagey about that, if that's the case. I haven't heard anybody of any sort suggest that it's been Ukrainians conducting the espionage. And the Russian government itself has not said as much. Generally, they attribute, fires and whatnot in strategic factories to accidents of one kind or another. It's probably something we won't know about until much later. Well, to kind of get away from the tactical side of things to the big picture, there was kind of a calibration, shall we say, of Ron DeSantis's earlier statements about Ukraine not being among the nation's vital national interests. He says that his statement was taken out of context, and he's since come out and issued statements that are much more pro-Ukrainian in nature. basically that he would continue support and that Putin's invasion was illegal and wrong and all that sort of thing. So that's a positive sign in so much as it shows that even those that are relatively skeptical about U.S. involvement in the conflict are coming around a little bit in terms of continued support, or at the very least, Ron DeSantis is recognizing that there's still a lot of support for Ukraine amongst Republican voters. So that bodes well for the 2024 election in the United States. That election is looked to by all parties involved as a significant marker for the conflict, since the outcome of that election could have significant impact on Western support for Ukraine, and by extension, Ukraine's prospects in the conflict.
Well, if DeSantis is pivoting to be pro-Ukraine with his narrative, are there candidates who are running who would wield that back?
Trump?
He would, yeah, he likes Russia, that's true.
I don't know that he likes Russia per se. I just think he doesn't. I just don't think he sees much interest. I don't think he really cares that much about the whole Ukraine conflict. I think for him, it's just extra drama with no real benefit.
Oh yeah, I remember the bullying Zelensky thing.
Yeah, that actually led to his impeachment.
Yeah.
The second one. So for him, the conflict in Ukraine is not a question of principle for the United States or a question of national security. For him, it's just another opportunity to try to extract some value in a transactional relationship. Yeah, I think I was reading recently that he's actually ahead of DeSantis by about 10 points in the polls right now. So he does actually have the lead again. There was a period where DeSantis was ahead, but it seems that he's kind of lost that lead since then. We'll see where things go.
Yeah, there are always those headlines about like Trump's being indicted again, kind of a thing, but we haven't really seen too much happen with that.
No. The only one saying that he was about to be arrested was him. He went on, he went online onto social media and he was saying, they're about to arrest me. I want my people to come out and protest and, fight for American democracy. And then, of course, nothing happens. Most likely they weren't going to arrest him until much later anyway. If they arrest him at all, that's not clear. But of course, Trump, being a savvy politician, never misses an opportunity to try to get his name in the news and create some drama. That's one of his hallmark moves politically.
Any press is good press. It's his playbook. Yeah.
Well, let's see. I think we talked about the drone last time, right? The U.S. drone that was downed over the Black Sea.
I don't remember that.
Well, there was I think it was like a Reaper drone or something that the U.S. was flying over the Black Sea. I don't know what it was doing. It was over international waters, though. I do think I remember reading that. And a Russian jet decided to buzz it. They decided to kind of fly at it and otherwise just sort of... It's not entirely clear what they were trying to do. They weren't trying to shoot it down. But what they did do is they tried to dump fuel on it. And there's actually video of that. So what the Russian jet did is it flew in real close, and during the flyby, it dumped fuel on the drone. Again, I have no idea why. I don't know what that's supposed to accomplish. But during one of the flybys, when they were trying to do that, the jet actually clipped the propeller on the drone. And the result is that they had to crash it into the Black Sea. It's just no longer controllable. So there was briefly some drama over that, but it never went anywhere. From as I recall, the statement from the chief of staff in the United States was that it was basically pilot error. They had not intended to actually ram the drone. Rather, it was just an accident. Some people on Reddit were joking that the U.S. was saying it was a skill issue, quote unquote.
Yeah, I've heard that one before.
So there was some fake drama over that. You know, it's not like they purposely shot down the drone or anything. So, you know, there was never going to be like retaliation or anything. Poland and Slovakia said that they were going to give Ukraine some jets within the week or within a couple weeks. I haven't heard any updates on that, but they've at least promised them. We already talked about the deployment of nuclear weapons to Belarus. You know, nobody really cares. It's basically just more empty threats. Let's see. Yeah. There was some news about occupied Ukraine. So apparently the Russian government is putting a lot of money into rebuilding Mariupol, which is the big coastal city in Donetsk. Donetsk, however that's pronounced. And so there is an effort there to at least pretend to care about the local population. Apparently, it's significantly more investment than was put into the Donetsk Separatist Republic or the Lugansk Separatist Republic after 2014, which has apparently been the result of some jealousy on the part of some of the separatists over there. Let's see. Oh, this was, again, I don't remember if we talked about this last time, so I apologize if I'm being redundant. But there was an office in Rostov that burned down. It was an FSB office. Rostov is a city in southwestern Russia. It's actually a port city on the Black Sea, if I remember correctly. And the Russian government attributed it to a short circuit. And there was a presidential aide to the president of Ukraine who said on Twitter that the incident was a quote-unquote manifestation of panic in Russia, and quote, Ukraine doesn't interfere but watches with pleasure, end quote. So not a story per se, but I just thought it was funny. A little Ukrainian schadenfreude there.
We didn't do that, but we're very happy about it.
Yeah. Well, let's see. I guess the only other thing I had in here is just some logistical notes. The Russians are expanding the age band of people who are eligible to be drafted. The band had been about 9 years. They're going to expand it to either 10 or 11. I don't think they've quite decided which yet, but the bandwidth will be broader. And so that's going to make relatively more people eligible for conscription. I think we might have talked about that last time too, come to think of it. But yeah, as I've probably already mentioned, that suggests that they're going to do another mobilization. They're probably gearing up for one. It may be more of a slow motion, incremental mobilization. That was another thing that one of the analysts was writing about that I read. It may not be like a big mobilization, like what they did last year. Rather, they may just do more of a slow drip feed type mobilization, where they're just generating enough forces to kind of replace losses in Ukraine. Something to keep an eye on. We'll see. Also, there's apparently big traffic jams in Poland, specifically along the border with Ukraine. They're backed up like 4 to 5 days. Damn. That's just how much stuff is being sent in to Ukraine, either in the form of economic aid or military aid. I think a lot of the military aid is coming in by plane, but some of it probably is still coming through road, if not also rail. But that is a logistical snarl there that is probably not doing them any favors. And then as far as tank production, I had some numbers. Apparently there's not a lot of new tank production. There's probably more tanks being repaired and refitted. That's probably the largest single source of tanks replacing losses on the front at this point. But from what I read, there's one principal tank factory in Russia, the Ural Vagon Zavod plant, which is producing about 20 tanks a month, and also refurbishing about 8 tanks a month. Now, there's also 3 other tank plants in Russia, which are rebuilding about 17 tanks a month. And it's worth mentioning, too, that there's 2 more tank plants that are supposed to come online over the course of 2023, basically, in coming months, quote unquote. So, it's not as though it's zero, but from what I read, the demand is outstripping supply of new tanks by an order of about 10. So they're not producing anywhere near enough to meet all of the demands of the Russian army at this point. They could scale up production, but it's not clear given all the difficulties that they're facing logistically, not only just within Russia, but also just in terms of sanctions and being cut off from broad swaths of international supply chains. It's not clear, given those difficulties, that they'll be able to scale production up enough to really ever meet all of the demand that they're facing. But they will try, so we'll see. That probably will become a point of effort on the part of the West. I think we talked about this before too, but there's probably going to be a renewed effort this year on the part of the United States especially, but also Europe and other allies, to try to crack down on sanctions evasion by the Russian government. Thus far, they've been relatively lenient. I don't think there's been a lot of expectation that the sanctions that have been implemented thus far would really be all that crippling. There was hope early on that maybe financial sanctions would have more of an impact, but that didn't happen. And since then, there was a desire to kind of take it slow so that Europe would have time to ease off of Russian natural gas and oil, among other Russian imports. But since then, the Europeans have done pretty well in terms of minimizing the amount of imports from Russia. So at this point, the foundation has kind of been set for a more thoroughgoing sanctions regime. So that'll probably put renewed pressure on Russian production, because right now they're probably getting more than they should be, given the alleged desire of the West to try to put pressure on them via sanctions. Yeah, that's about all I had for today, as far as Ukraine anyway.
There was a related question someone just asked. What is keeping the Russian economy and war machine alive?
So I think there's a couple things. One, probably the biggest factor is inventory. The Russians had a massive inventory of stuff left over from the Cold War. A lot of it got sold after the collapse of the Soviet Union, but they still retained a lot of stuff. And they've been bringing a lot of that stuff out of inventory for use in the conflict. There's even been reports of, T-54s and T-55s being deployed out to Ukraine. There was a video of a whole trainload of them being shipped out. And those tanks are like 70 years old.
Damn.
Yeah, I think those were modern in the 1950s or something like that. Yeah, it's not a new tank. And the fact that they are kind of whipping them out, for deployment illustrates some of the logistical difficulties they're having procuring new equipment. But they have so many that, that is a viable choice. Obviously it's not optimal in terms of the quality of the equipment, but like I mentioned before, it's an industrial war. Quantity is more important, relatively speaking, than quality. So if you can crank out a whole shit ton of tanks, even if they're shit tanks, that'll serve you better than if you try to wait around a long time and maybe just send out a few high quality tanks that you take the time to manufacture. So it does make sense, but it doesn't reflect well, again, on the logistical situation. So that's one factor keeping the Russian military going. Lots of inventory. And it's not just tanks, it's also, ammunition and things like that.
Yeah, and the super old tanks aren't getting any younger, so
yeah.
Better use them in a 2020s war than in a 2040s war.
Yeah, exactly. Fair point. But there's also sanctions evasion. Right now, it's not very difficult for smugglers to set up shell companies in places like Singapore or Hong Kong or Turkey. Turkey's a big one, actually. And then try to import stuff that Russia can't buy legally just from there. So, they might not be able to legally buy stuff directly from, say, Germany, but, a shell company in Turkey can totally buy that and then export it from Turkey into Russia. Since Turkey is not entirely on board with the full set of Western sanctions, they still allow that. And they've certainly benefited a great deal economically from that trade. So that's another factor. They're still able to import a lot of stuff that they need. Not as much as they were before the war, mind you. Sanctions have had an effect. And even in the cases where they can still get the stuff they need, they have to pay a premium for it on account of, using smuggling networks and shell companies and whatnot. There are frictional costs to doing that. But it has contributed to the maintenance of the Russian army's ability to stay current in the field. Another factor, another factor is just manufacturing. They do have some manufacturing capacity, but they've lost a lot since the end of the Cold War. One of the things that really surprised me was that I read this from an analyst on Twitter, so take it for what it's worth, but I think they're credible anyway. What they said is that the Russian military-industrial complex actually lost the ability to make barrels for artillery and tanks. That is to say, gun barrels, right? Basically the gun for these weapon systems. Apparently that was a skill set that was just lost over the course of the 1990s. Like, all of the people that knew how to do it retired, and all the people that could have learned how to do it just got other jobs or left the country or whatever. So apparently they'd been dependent on imports, either dependent on imports or inventory in order to replace barrels for artillery and for tanks. Artillery in particular can go through barrels relatively quickly, especially if you're using them very heavily. And actually, one of the logistical choke points I've read that the Russian army is struggling with is finding new barrels for the artillery that they are using very heavily in the conflict. It's been said that the Russian army is an artillery-centric army, and especially with the offensives in the summer and fall of 2022, the Russians were leaning very heavily on their artillery, and apparently that created a lot of logistical problems with the procurement of new barrels for those weapons. So that could be as much of a factor inhibiting Russian fire support in the conflict as much as, say, shortages of ammunition for artillery. So that is a significant factor. But limitations of manufacturing aside, they do have the capacity to produce new stuff. It's, again, not nearly enough to replace everything that they're losing or to meet demand generally, but that is a factor keeping them in the fight, so to speak, as the questioner said. So manufacturing, sanctions evasion, and the other thing I mentioned,
Inventory.
the inventory, thank you. All of those are relevant factors. Also, it's worth mentioning, too, that for basically the first year of the war, from February into late 2022, the Russians were still making billions of dollars from natural gas sales to Europe. And that obviously gives them a big pool of resources to use in order to do all of the things I mentioned, to continue to pay for the production of new equipment and weapons, to pay for agents and shell companies to buy stuff from the West illegally in Turkey and other places. All of that stuff costs money. And the Europeans were basically subsidizing it by way of natural gas purchases. I don't think that could have been helped. I don't think it was ever reasonable to expect them to just shut off the natural gas completely from Russia. But the fact is that was a major factor contributing to the ability of the Russian army to continue fighting. That money was very useful. And I would point out it wasn't just useful in terms of the war effort. It was also useful in terms of mitigating the economic damage from financial sanctions, the financial sanctions that were implemented basically in the first week of the conflict, in which the Russian central bank had its reserves frozen, overseas, all of its assets and reserves and whatnot. For those of you who maybe just are not familiar with how central banks work, central bank reserves are maybe not sacrosanct per se, but you're not supposed to just seize them. That's considered like a really aggressive, borderline, warlike move. And that was an extremely aggressive move by the West to do that. That was basically breaking norms in the financial sector, seizing those assets. So even though the broader sanctions regime was relatively light compared to what they could have done, the fact that they went for the central bank's assets was actually extraordinarily aggressive. It was kind of a weird dichotomy. They started really strong with the financial sanctions, in particular targeting Russia's central bank, but they didn't really follow it up that much, nearly as much as they could have. which is why I was saying earlier that 2023 is probably going to see much more effort in that regard. There's probably going to be much more extensive efforts to limit exports of Russian oil and natural gas, and then also to go after sanctions evasion. Because in 2022, there was only really so much they could do without causing significant knock-on damage to Europe's broader economy. And that was sort of the big question, like how do we juggle the need to pressure Russia with the need to prevent some kind of economic recession or implosion in Europe? And so the trade-off was to go after Russia financially, but not so much in terms of the actual goods that really comprise the core of the Russian economy. Again, oil and natural gas. So, again, that's just why they didn't go after it that much, but because they didn't, that was a major source of revenue, and that revenue was important to Russia's ability to continue fighting and to continue funding the war effort. So those are four major factors, like right there, for how the Russians were able to stay in the fight through 2022. Those factors, again, I suspect will change, or at least will come under renewed duress over the course of the present year. The degree to which that's true, questionable. I can't say for sure just what the West is planning in that regard, but I have to think that they'll go a lot harder in 2023. Let's see. That's all we had for that.
The chat's having fun discussing hypothetical tank battles between the most modern US tanks and these old ones.
Probably pretty favorable, although I would point out that it's, battles between tanks are never just about the quality of the tank itself. Probably much more important is training and logistics. Whenever I've heard like actual experts or people with experience in the military, or just people much more knowledgeable about the subject than I am, the thing that they always kind of came back to was like the effectiveness and quality of the people actually operating the weapons system in question. So even if you have a good tank, like a good, well-designed modern tank, it may just be entirely wasted because the people using it don't know how to use it properly. Mm. That was actually a problem that the Soviets faced very early in World War II, specifically early in Operation Barbarossa. So, they had this really good tank, the T-34, that they'd been producing. They didn't have nearly as many as they needed, at that stage of the war, but they did have a pretty good number early in the war. And the Germans kind of struggled to handle them because it was a pretty robust design that they weren't really expecting. And what happened is that even though it was a solid tank, a lot of the Russian military personnel using it just were not well trained, had no experience, and were just outclassed by the German units that they came up against. So even though they had better equipment, it ended up not being that big a difference maker, just because a lot of people did not know how to leverage that qualitative advantage in equipment.
Yeah, that sounds like me playing Apex Legends or a shooter game. You pick up a really, really nice gun that someone who knows how to use it would feel like is a great asset, but you don't know how to aim it or shoot it or what its rate of fire is or what its recoil is, so you just miss the whole time. So it's as though you didn't even have it.
Yeah, so training and having enough fuel, the Soviets also struggled with logistics through much of the war. Those are like more important than factors. I would point out here, and this is something of a side note, there's a story I remember of the commander, I think of a Soviet tank division in 1941, and he was supposed to launch a counterattack against the Germans, who were like operating well into the rear of Soviet front lines. And on his way basically to attack them, he accidentally drove his whole last division or brigade or whatever it was into a swamp. And he just immediately shot himself because he knew that there was no way that he was going to walk away from that. He knew that the government was just going to either kill him or require him basically to shoot himself. So just on the spot, he was like, all right, I'm out. Mm-hmm. But that's another example of how subpar leadership can undermine a qualitative advantage. The Soviet officer corps had been just devastated by the purges in the 30s. So there was lots and lots of people like that who were just so inexperienced that they had circles run around them by the Germans. And they made a lot of rookie mistakes that got a lot of people killed unnecessarily. Not their fault. If you're inexperienced, there's only so much you can do about that, right? It's better to make sure that your people are trained before they go fight against one of the most powerful war machines in the history of military warfare. That's not an ideal time to make people learn, but the Soviets had to do that, and the early results were very poor, predictably so. But yeah, I don't think that if M1s had a modern, well-trained crew from the United States, for example, or maybe one of the other countries that uses it, I don't think there's too many countries that use M1s. Probably mostly Gulf monarchies, if I had to guess. Yeah, if it's a US crew, they would do probably really well, even if the Russian crew were pretty experienced. Because the M1 definitely has a big advantage over the T-54. But probably a crew from someplace like a Gulf monarchy would be much less experienced and probably doesn't have nearly as much training. So they might struggle against an experienced crew in a T-54 if they knew what they were doing. It's a big if. I don't know if the main gun on a T-54 can even penetrate the armor on an M1, but maybe they can find one of the weak spots, maybe in the rear. If they can pull that off, there's a chance. Yeah, getting shot with a gun that can't penetrate your armor may not destroy you, but it'll definitely make you very uncomfortable. It's not as though it's nothing. You'll definitely feel that.
Chat is now asking about the Israel stuff. I did take a note of that before we got started, that Netanyahu fired his defense minister, I think.
Yeah.
That happened today.
Yeah, that's recent news. So the Minister of Defense in Israel came out and said openly that he thought the government needed to just end the effort to do the reform. He didn't say that he opposed it entirely. He just said that they needed to halt it, basically, so that they could reach some kind of consensus that the broader part of Israeli society could agree on, rather than just trying to impose the current iteration, which obviously is extremely controversial. So coming out and making that statement was enough for him to get fired. He has been removed from his position. That's been pretty controversial. It's again, like you say, it just happened recently. So, the fallout from his removal is still unfolding. But the early results are not very positive for the government. The head of a labor federation in Israel, the Histadrut Labor Federation, I trust somebody from Israel knows more about them than I do. But that labor federation has said that he was astonished. Well, the head of that federation said he was astonished by the removal, and he promised, quote unquote, a dramatic announcement on Monday.
Wait, who promised a dramatic announcement?
This is the head of the labor federation in question.
Oh.
And Israel's consul general in New York has said that he has resigned over the dismissal.
Huh.
So that's not a whole lot for now, but the fact that it happened in the first few hours after the removal of the defense minister kind of suggests that there may be more coming.
Mm.
Israeli society is already at a fever pitch right now. This issue is boiling over easily. There's just people all over Israel's government at different levels of the government that are so opposed to this that they've all but said that if the government moved forward, then they would just not recognize its legitimacy. And it's not clear where things would go from there.
It's interesting that they just fire this guy instead of using him as a way to be a bridge to build legitimacy in their country. Of okay, we have someone who's finding some nuance here and is thinking about the people.
Well, the argument that Netanyahu and his people make is that, they won the last election and that they have a mandate and that their judicial reform, among other policies that they're pushing, should be implemented as the representation of the will of the people. So from their perspective, they are the people, they are representing the people, and that these efforts to stop them are inherently undemocratic, and that they run against the spirit of Israeli democracy in so much as they're trying to stop a legitimately elected government from fulfilling its perceived mandate. So that's their perspective. Now, of course, that's a biased perspective. That's very much them kind of trying to justify their approach to this problem, which it has to be said is a very forceful, aggressive approach. Like, if you only have 50+1% support, in the legislature, certainly among Israeli society more broadly, that really does not suggest a broad mandate for large reforms. If you do want to do large reforms with that kind of majority, with such a slim majority, one would think you would be a lot more incremental and cooperative in terms of the way that you approach the opposition with these kinds of reforms. But that's not been what they've done. They've said, we have the majority, and so we're just going to do what we want. And if you don't like it, then you're undemocratic. That's been tried. Lots of countries have, forceful governments in power that have kind of steamrolled the opposition legally to get what they want, but it's never popular, and it's guaranteed to get you a very negative response. So that's effectively what Netanyahu's government is doing. Like, they have a very unpopular change that they can implement legally in a way that is technically legal, but which is sufficiently controversial that they may cause unrest that will negate any benefit they get from it, to the point where they're calling into question the very legitimacy of the Israeli government that they're leading. So, they can cry about undemocratic backlash and, people blocking the streets, all they want. But the fact is, democracies do not function by way of sheer majoritarianism. Even if you can legally do something, forbearance suggests that you should hold back if a certain critical threshold of opposition is met. Democracies are supposed to be about cooperation, forbearance, and recognition of certain limits, even if those limits are only informal in nature. And it really seems pretty clear, I think, to me and to a lot of other people who have, studied democracy, liberal democracy specifically, constitutional democracy, that the Israeli government has encountered such a threshold at this point, and that they would be well served in trying to push back, well, not push back, but in trying to slow down this effort and to try to take a different tack. They can still do the judicial reform. Even people within the governing coalition, albeit a minority, but even people within the coalition have said that they want judicial reform, but they don't want to cram it down the country's throat like this in a way that's going to cause this degree of unrest. They would prefer more of a consensual approach in which there is broad-based for a judicial reform that creates something resembling a constitution for the country, and in which the judiciary will still have a role in which it can act as a check and balance on the executive. That is not too much to ask. But the Netanyahu government, for the most part, is still trying to push this through. They did announce that they were going to halt temporarily an effort to pass certain elements of the judicial reform, but they have not halted their effort to change one key reform. They have not. Well, they have announced that they're not going to halt attempts to pass a key element of the reform, which has to do with the appointment of judges. So basically, if they pass this reform, then they're going to stack the court in a way in which political appointees appointed by the government are going to have a clear-cut majority and will be able to determine judicial outcomes, at which point the judiciary is de facto controlled by the government and will no longer be a real check on power. So the fact that they've said, yes, we're going to halt some of the reforms, but not the one that is perhaps the most important, suggests that the notion that they're going to kind of take a more cooperative tack is not really genuine. They're not really being fully honest when they say that they're willing to kind of compromise on this. So, thus far, the compromises have been just totally token in nature. And it's worth mentioning, too, that they're not stopping the reform efforts on those other points. They're just halting them temporarily. So they're not even saying that they're not going to do them, or that they're open to negotiating about them. They're just saying that we're going to delay this a little bit and do the stuff you hate later. So this is not a government that really is open to compromise, given the attitude that they've taken. I'm not saying that they're incapable of it. I'm not saying they haven't done it in the past. I'm saying that their approach to this issue currently, and for basically the past several months, has not been one that suggests they're open to negotiation or compromise on this. This really seems to be something they're pushing very, very hard for and want, regardless of consequences. And if that's how they're going to do it, then this is the response they can expect. It's no shock that there is a dramatic pushback in broader Israeli society to this. Maybe they can pass it and then there's nothing anybody can do, and then the problem just goes away and people are angry about it but just have to deal with it. That's possible, and that's probably what the Netanyahu government is angling for. They'll get used to it as a favorite sort of response of ideologues when you question them about whether or not people will accept radical changes that they want. They'll just get used to it, and then it won't be controversial anymore. Which is magical thinking, by the way. That's never true. That's never how it works. There are always long-term and medium-term consequences to radical reforms pushed through without popular support. But that seems to be the tack that they're taking here, and it's not going to work. I don't think, at least not without some kind of significant fallout. And I think it's worth mentioning, too, that the degree of pushback that they're meeting is borderline extreme. Like, I have not seen this level of civil unrest, but also mobilization of civil society in almost any society that has seen mass unrest over the past 10 years. Like, this is an unusual degree of pushback. And it's actually genuinely impressive that they're able to do it. It's fairly organized. It's not like, some of the protests that we've talked about over the past couple of years, which have been, popular and large, but kind of peter out for lack of organization and lack of elite support. In this case, the unrest, the protests, whatnot against the government do have elite support. They do have organization. They do have key institutional actors on their side, both inside and outside of government. And they are well organized to the point where they actually do pose a significant challenge to the government. Most any other government around the world facing this degree of pushback would recognize that this is not sustainable for anybody, and that there are significant risks of crisis that come out of this degree of pushback. But they're still moving forward anyway. So this is very much a gambler's approach to major unpopular reform. The Israeli government right now seems to be really gambling that they can make this happen without significant consequence. And all of the signs say that no, that is not going to happen. But who's to say? It remains to be seen. But that's pretty much where we are. That's the latest news. The defense minister was removed. There's been negative reaction, predictably so. And in the meantime, the government is pushing forward with the passage of that one particular law about the appointment of judges. That's going to be passed possibly within the week if they go forward according to plan, as it is thus far.
And it's a shitload of people protesting, and you're saying there's a lot of broad-based support for it, so it's not just a grassroots kind of deal?
Yeah, I mean, obviously people who support Netanyahu are not very keen. They're pretty happy with the reform that they're trying to push through. But yeah, amongst the opposition, amongst the, basically half of Israeli society that does not openly support the Netanyahu coalition, they are almost uniformly opposed. And there is a small minority, even within the governing coalition, which is also skeptical about the way that the government is approaching this and is asking them to slow down and take a more deliberative, consensual approach to the judicial reform. So there is arguably even a majority in that sense that is opposed at this point. And again, it's not just people on the street. It's not just like regular people who are coming out and protesting. There are people in power, like in the government, that have said that this is not going to be acceptable. The judicial court is signaling that, they may well strike it down, at which point there's going to be a much bigger problem. But there's also people within the military that have said that they don't consider this move to be legitimate, that they are concerned for the integrity of the Israeli democratic system. Reservists have said that they're not going to serve, or at least have threatened as much. The attorney, the legal advisor, they have some technical name for her, has already come out and said that, she may declare that Netanyahu is not fit for government, which led to the passage of a law that says that she cannot do that like very quickly. That was another development from the past week. The Israeli parliament did pass a law that says that a sitting member of parliament cannot be declared unfit to govern unless there is, I think, something like a 2/3 majority vote in parliament. So before, the equivalent of an attorney general in Israeli politics could just do that on their own. And now there is more of a barrier. So, there is something to be said for that. That is a more democratic approach. But again, the original criticism is, why is this suddenly a problem now? Why is it suddenly such a priority when it was not at any point, at virtually any point in the previous 10 plus years of Netanyahu governed Israeli history? The timing is more than a little bit suspicious there, which is part of the reason that the opposition does not think this is like a good faith effort to reform the judiciary. The strong suspicion is that this is really more of a power grab than anything. So yeah, it does have broad-based popular support up and down Israeli society. That is to say, opposition to the reform. And I don't want to oversell it. There are a lot of people that support the Israeli government on this. There are lots of pro-government people that voted for Netanyahu, or maybe one of the settler parties that he's currently in a coalition with. And all of them are pretty happy to push forward with it. There was one spokesman for the coalition who was talking to an interviewer on BBC Radio. And, his attitude was just absolutely defiant. His whole attitude is that, yes, the minority in a democracy deserves to be heard. But what about conservative Jews? What about the settlers? They're minorities too. And they feel that their rights have been tread upon in the past. Not least because of what they perceive to be an activist judiciary, which has blocked their attempts to pursue what they perceive to be, their legitimate rights. They think, for example, that Jewish seminary students, conservative Hasidic Jewish seminary students, should not have to serve in the Israeli army as a part of mandatory military service that every Israeli is subject to. And the courts basically struck that down themselves without an act of parliament, to kind of back it up. The argument made by the judiciary was that it was unfair for one particular group to be exempt from military service in that way. And so the conservative Hasidic Jewish community in Israel hated that, and they've been on a mission to overturn it ever since. And from their perspective, that was a violation of their, rights as a minority. They thought it was discriminatory, given that they do have what they perceive to be legitimate religious reasons not to be made to serve in that way. So for them, they're just in a battle with a partisan judiciary, and they don't see any issue with what they're doing, which again, they argued is going to make the judiciary and the overall political system more democratic, not less. So that's the kind of attitude that you're dealing with.
So there is a substantial bloc that are going to be in favor of this, and they have their reasons for doing so, but in terms of the majority of the population, most people are against it at some level.
Probably, yeah. Probably a slim majority or a very, very large minority, one or the other. Yeah, this kind of goes back to, stuff we've talked about before, like a 50-50 referendum, right? Mm-hmm. Like if a referendum passes with 51% support, that does not actually solve anything. Because that means that no matter what you do, you're going to piss off a huge chunk of the population.
Yeah.
Which is why referendums are not generally the best way to deal with contentious political issues. If there is a very close split on a major issue, it's much better to take a deliberative approach where you try to reach a compromise that can result in something resembling a consensus. That's the best way to deal with that. But again, that's not the approach being taken here. Here they have a very slim majority in parliament, and they're trying to use that as an excuse to impose changes that a huge minority of the population opposes. And they're going to end up with a result no different than any of the other examples we can point to. Brexit, Catalan, like those are just some of the more famous ones. Like none of those has resulted in anything resembling closure to the issue that was being voted on. Some people got to learn the hard way, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's about all I had on Israel, though, as far as updates.
So they're having a major go of it. Chat also asked about France and if there was an update on the situation there. I think they've also got some stuff.
I mean, the underlying calculus hasn't really changed. I think the big news last week was that there was a vote of no confidence for the government, and the government survived. You know, they're not going to change, but they did not survive by as much of a margin as they were expecting. So it could be that there's some weakness being signaled there, and there has been renewed effort to have another vote of no confidence, perhaps in order to exploit that weakness that is now perceived. There's also a lot of pressure on the prime minister to step down, to resign specifically. I don't know if he's the same guy targeted in the vote of no confidence, but there has been pressure on him specifically to resign. And Macron has been, defiant, predictably so. He's saying that, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to stick it out. But he's definitely under a lot of pressure in Parliament. They are bringing the heat there. But that said, it's also really not clear that there's going to be enough votes to actually change anything. It seems like the government coalition has enough votes, either with allied parties on the left or right in order to survive any effort to kind of upend it. So France, as per usual, is stuck politically. It seems like they're stuck in a deadlock over this. The reform probably will go through. That's pretty much what I said last time, but and I haven't seen anything since then that suggests that there's enough pressure that's going to be brought to bear to make the government reverse course.
So you said they had a vote of no confidence, and then they had a vote of even less confidence?
They had a vote of no confidence. And after the government survived by a smaller margin than expected, they started pushing for another one. They haven't held the second one yet, but they are trying to get it, since they think that maybe they can get enough votes to actually win it this time. But that remains to be seen. Yeah, again, I doubt they'll be able to get enough votes for it. Conservatives, there are plenty of conservatives that don't like Macron, but in general, I think he has enough support amongst conservative parties in particular to survive in a vote of no confidence over this particular issue. Because I don't think pension reform is something that conservatives really mind too much. There are conservatives in France who oppose it, but it's also the type of reform that conservative parties have tried to pass in France previously. So I don't know that it's as much of a issue for them as it is for, say, Mélenchon, like the lead left-wing guy in the French politics right now. For them, big deal. They're the ones that are principally leading this, leading the protests, that is to say. But I don't think they're going to be able to get the votes to really make anything happen. So, again, just deadlock, more of the same. Lots of interesting video footage.
Of the French protests?
Yeah, this is very large. They tend to go pretty hard.
Yeah. Well, they're pretty notorious for their intense revolutions.
Yeah, they're quite practiced, certainly. But I don't know that it's going to do them too much good this time. Now, I really don't know how much French protests have really done over the past 30 years, but in particular, I don't think they've been nearly as successful in that, in using that kind of pressure to extract concessions from the government. I don't think that's been nearly as successful over the past 30 years as it was over the course of, say, the 1950s and 60s. I think we also talked last time about how protests are not nearly as effective now as they used to be. So that kind of is part and parcel of that argumentation. Let's see. Well, What else did we have? Were there any other questions or anything you wanted to get to?
Yeah, there is one person who is asking about a trans rights issue in Texas. I'm not sure if it was a bill or what.
Texas has trans rights?
Yeah,
Could have fooled me.
yeah, I don't know.
Debatable. Yeah, the Texas GOP has really made a lot of political hay, so to speak, out of going after this, that, or the other hot button trans issue or talking point, or however you want to frame it. So yeah, they've been going. I don't even really keep track of them anymore. Generally they pass. I think there's generally enough support in Congress to make it happen, in Texas Congress to make it happen. But sometimes there's opposition if it's, particularly egregious or something, or just unenforceable, which a lot of them are, in effect. Yeah, I don't remember what the latest one was, but I just remember kind of rolling my eyes and thinking, yeah, that sounds like something that would happen here.
Yeah, a lot of times people will take shots at a demographic that's seen as opposition just to pander to the majority without actually doing anything substantive.
Yeah, I think in this case it was something to do with gender affirming care, if I'm not mistaken. Try to stop parents from doing that. But I don't think they really defined it very specifically. So it's kind of another broadly ambiguously defined law that's probably just going to either get shot down by the courts or is just going to cause more trouble than it's worth. It's generally the way ideologically written laws pan out. They're just more for show than they are for actual governance.
Chat was asking for a refresh as to why protests are less effective now than they used to be.
Basically, it's easier to get people out on the street because of social media. Information travels much faster. And so you can kind of get people motivated to come out for a given cause, get them informed even about a new cause relatively quickly, or just very informed in general about something that's been going on for a while. And also you can just get them into a particular one area. You can say that there's going to be a protest at, this square or this location much more easily, and get that information out more rapidly than you could before. So in that sense, it's easy to get protests started, but the issue is, what do you do after? Like, it takes organization in order to leverage political pressure into political change. And a lot of these protests are basically leaderless. They don't have any kind of institutional background. There's no leader that can negotiate with the actual stakeholder in the system. It's like a president or whoever. There's nobody they can kind of talk to and compromise with and reach any kind of negotiated settlement. So basically, leaders are kind of trained effectively to just wait out these kinds of protests. They're there and then they're gone and then nothing changes. And that's happened enough times that, political leaders of one kind or another in power just kind of wait them out. That's sort of the equilibrium move there for a lot of these. So lack of organization is a problem. If you're in an authoritarian political system, it's actually easier to use technology to suppress dissent. So that's actually a big deterrent. That's basically what happened to most of the people that were protesting in China last December against zero COVID. The government kind of let them go for a day or two, and then it kind of swooped in and used technology, specifically phones and phone data, to figure out who was there, and then to pressure them, their families, and in a lot of cases arrest them. In some cases, disappearing them. So, that's a deterrent. That's a good reason not to go protest if you know that if you go that you're going to be identified and punished after the fact. So that's a problem for authoritarian political systems. But even for, open political systems, it's hard to leverage political discontent into any substantive action. The lack of organization is the main one, but also just the lack of coherence, the lack of leadership, the lack of any coherent goals that can be pointed to. You yourself mentioned the Occupy protests back in the day. They had just different goals. Like, they had nothing specific they really pointed to. It was just Anybody could come and just have their preferred pet project become part of the movement, but that meant that there was nothing in particular that they were aiming for, and in turn, that there was nothing in particular that people in power could kind of offer them.
Yeah, that's kind of the big picture of protests is either the protest needs to cause something within the existing system to change in a way that like follows the rules of that system, or you overthrow the entire system and have a revolution, which is very hard to do and doesn't happen that often. And I think people who go out to the protest, they have the energy of wanting change and expressing their discontent, which is a necessary ingredient, but you also have to have the clarity of your mission, and you have to have some unity for the protest as a whole if you want to be able to, okay, now we're talking to our representatives and we can talk about how we want this implemented in our country or in our state, wherever you live. It's pretty tough to do. Yeah, and the anonymity going down as camera and filming stuff goes up. Like, if you go to a protest and you do bad stuff now, you're probably caught on video. That's just how it is. We saw January 6th stuff, and it's like you can watch full HD movie of basically everything that happened just because there are so many phones that are actively filming during stuff like that.
Yeah, exactly.
So in two cases, one case is you, the protester, are doing bad stuff, you're now going to get in more trouble. And then, like you said before, if you have an authoritarian government who just wants to scare protesters, they now have direct evidence against you. So it's a lot more dangerous for you to protest than it would have been back in the Occupy era, where, yeah, some people had phone cameras, but they didn't have the storage to just mass a bunch of video data on their phone. So you could be more anonymous. I had a Guy Fawkes mask on when I was there too.
A man of taste.
Yeah, back when that was cool.
Oh, is it not cool anymore?
I don't know if people still wear those that often. It's become like more tied with the anonymous internet group, which I wasn't wearing it for that purpose. It was just like, that was a cool movie of them standing up against the system, and I'm going to stand up against the system, and they're never going to know who I am.
Gotcha. Yeah, so if I wear one at a protest, I'm going to be showing my age. Gotcha.
He's a millennial. Look at him.
Yeah. Yeah, getting older sucks. I don't recommend it. I guess I shouldn't be too bitter about it.
You're going to have to be born in some age bracket.
Yeah.
We just make use of the time that's given to us.
Well, there's the old Chinese proverb, right? It's do not begrudge growing old, because it is a privilege denied to many.
Yeah, that's true. That's a good quote.
So I can't be too butthurt about it. But these damn whippersnappers, Neuro, I'm telling you.
Yeah.
They can make you feel old.
Yeah, the Zoomer phrases have been jamming to some of them.
Well, I sent you an article in Discord. It was an article I was reading today, and it talks about this subject of how protests have become less effective over time.
Mm-hmm.
So that will answer that question much better than I can off the top of my head. I'm struggling to remember some of the specifics, but lack of organization of recent protests is the main one. You know, the decentralized digital approach to organizing protests and open opposition to governments does not really deliver great results, it seems.
Mm-hmm.
Even if it can create much more dramatic shows of force in the short term.
Yeah, you can get them to show up, but you can't get them to stay as well. I think also our attention span is lower now, too. Like, there's just so much that's happening at such a rapid pace that we have access to listen to and learn about and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
But to keep someone on task for something for more than 4 minutes can be a little bit dicey.
Yeah, I remember the what was his name? Do you remember the Lord's Resistance Army?
No.
So that was a militia / terrorist group / bandit group that was operating in Uganda for a long time. And they were just sort of they kind of ran a low-level insurgency against the government for several decades. And there was kind of out of the blue, like 10, 12 years ago, a kind of a series of Facebook videos and memes that were trying to raise awareness about the Lord's Resistance Army and some of the atrocities that have been committed by that group, and more specifically by its leader. What was his name? Like specifically, Kony, that's who it was, Joseph Kony. He was the leader of the LRA. And so this group, social media group, just decided to raise awareness about that whole conflict. And it went viral for whatever reason. And like for the first time that I could remember, since I'd started watching, following international news and whatnot, Joseph Kony was like headline news, both online and in the actual like mainstream media. And it wasn't too long after that the U.S. actually started sending advisors to Uganda, to help them out against that insurgency. So, that's an example of a sort of flash movement that kind of comes out of nowhere and takes advantage of the digital space. And in that case, it did have some substantive impact. But the thing is that there was no long-term public interest in that. Mm-hmm. Like, it was only a few months later that people mostly forgot about it. Like, I don't even think people remember that the U.S. still has a deployment of troops in Uganda helping the government there with the LRA. Like, that's basically just in the memory hole. Like, it only took a few months for it to just completely fall off people's radar. Part of that is because the guy that led that NGO that was responsible for starting that viral campaign was kind of lost his legitimacy, I guess. He was basically filmed running around naked on a road acting crazy because he was high as a kite. And after that, his whole NGO kind of lost public interest for obvious reasons. But even if that hadn't happened, probably public interest would have collapsed anyway. It just, public interest in that kind of stuff just kind of waxes and wanes rapidly. So yeah, that just speaks to your, example. Like, people's attention spans online are very limited.
People spamming Kony 2012 in the chat now. Yeah, I remember when that was a meme.
Yeah, back in the day. It's more than 10 years ago. Let's see. Did we have more questions?
So,
there were a couple in here.
The Dalai Lama said what their spiritual successor is going to be, or I guess who. Maybe more of a religious question, but I remember in the past we've talked about China wanted to decide themselves who the successor was going to be, so they might make a play at that somehow. I don't know if they already said who they think their person should be.
Oh yeah, the party already has somebody they've designated as the successor. Mm-hmm. Yeah, he's been around for several years now. It's probably, he was a younger guy when I first read about him, but he must be an adult by now. But yeah, they've got a guy ready to go for when the Dalai Lama dies, for sure. But I hadn't heard about the Dalai Lama himself picking a successor. Yeah, that's news to me. I don't think it's going to matter that much. Most likely Beijing will get their way on that. Mm-hmm. Yeah, not having access to Tibet is going to be a big handicap for whoever comes next. The Dalai Lama has relatively more legitimacy just because he actually was, born and raised there, actually did rule Tibet for a while. But, the next guy, if he's just some dude who is like hanging out in Bhutan or something, he's not going to be seen as nearly as legitimate, I would expect. Or at least he'll have a harder time. Yeah, being a government in exile is hard business. It gets harder the longer you're out of power.
There were a couple questions in Discord as well.
Yeah, I saw those.
Another one from the chat. In your opinion, does the Fed have any idea what they're doing?
Yes. Yes, they do. I don't really go after the Fed as hard as a lot of people, especially in markets. But yeah, they do know what they're doing. The problem is that the problem is that current circumstances are those of very high uncertainty. In general, we're in a period, we talked about this before too, we're just in a period where we don't have a lot of precedent to point to and use to understand what's going on in the economy. And that's, relevant because the economy has changed a lot over the past couple decades. The degree and pace of technological innovation and structural changes in the economy has just been rapid. And because there had not really been a whole lot of stimulus, well, maybe stimulus isn't the right word, but there hadn't been a lot of, variables stimulating the economy such that we could understand how it reacted, to different stimuli. The result is that we're in a position now where we don't really know how it behaves or to whatever, given stimuli, be it interest rate changes or a pandemic, a war, just all this random shit that's been happening. So that really puts economists at a disadvantage. Like if we have a lot of data that we can point to as precedent and study and analyze, then we can build a pretty decent picture of how the economy works and then make predictions with relatively high confidence. But we just can't do that right now. And that's just put all economists, not just the Fed, in a position where we have to caveat everything. Like we just can't predict with confidence, and we can't even really fully interpret with confidence what's happening like now. Like even with the data we're getting, quarter to quarter, month to month, like there's a lot of struggle going on amongst economists in trying to interpret that data and trying to make sense of it. A lot of it is often, contradictory and just doesn't jibe with established theory. So, we're doing the best we can. Is what I would say to that. Given the methodological tools we have available, we're doing the best we can. Which is why I say that overall, yes, the Fed does know what it's doing. It's got a good statistical toolkit with which to study the economy and the data that it has. But the issue is more in the interpretation. And nobody is in a position to be able to do better, really. I don't think anybody else has like better models or is better at interpreting the data as it is right now. I think the others can maybe end up being more accurate, and there are maybe others who have more insight into certain sectors of the economy. But nobody else but the Federal Reserve, at least in the United States, is in a position where they have to kind of study the whole enchilada, like the whole economy, and try to make sense of it. And I think overall, while they've definitely struggled and made mistakes, I think in general, they've had good reasons to make those mistakes. They weren't mistakes made out of stupidity. They were made earnestly and honestly. Those were mistakes anybody could have made given circumstances. To put it another way, I think they have made the best decisions they could given the information they have.
Do you think that they would have done better if they visualized the whole U.S. economy as an enchilada?
No.
Okay.
No, I'm afraid not. But it were otherwise.
Sounds tasty to me, but sure.
Enchiladas are indeed delicious. I will not contradict you there. But yeah, overall, I think the Fed is doing okay, given the circumstances. Again, they made mistakes. They should have started hiking rates sooner, maybe even as early as like 2017, 2018. But, that didn't happen for a variety of reasons. You can argue that quantitative easing went too far, both after 2008 and also during the pandemic. But that's highly debatable. But I think regardless, they had pretty good grounds to do all of that stuff. They didn't do it arbitrarily. They had theoretical reasons and empirical reasons to do everything they did. Oh, God. Hindsight is 2020. Oh, man. I don't think yesterday's pizza agrees with me.
Should have gotten an enchilada.
Now you keep talking about it. I may end up getting one tomorrow. My diet is just absolutely wild and unconstrained these days. So I may just give in and say, hey, fuck it. Let's have an enchilada
I was
tomorrow.
hypnotized into getting an enchilada.
Advertising works.
Yep.
It can work. But yeah, I think what doesn't know what it's doing, yeah, I think overall it does. But again, the caveat is that they've made mistakes, and they're probably going to make more mistakes given how unpredictable the economy is these days. So that would be my concession.
I know that the Fed is kind of a classic, I don't know if punching bag is the right word, maybe scapegoat is better, for libertarians. Basically anyone who kind of wants the government's footprint to be a smaller scale. I think part of the issue might be they don't like the amount of power and responsibility that the Fed has. So the Fed, like when it's said that way, I think they're usually about to criticize it in some way, which it is fair to criticize the different branches and operations of government and that kind of thing. So I'm not saying you can't do that.
I was actually watching a documentary, an episode rather, of Frontline. You've heard of Frontline, right?
Hell yeah. I was actually partway through a documentary on the war in Iraq. I think it just came out recently. I saw it on the
I'll have to
documentary
check that out.
subreddit. Yeah.
Well, I was watching a Frontline episode about the Fed, actually. It was called Age of Easy Money. It's on YouTube. You can find all of them on YouTube pretty much. And it was basically just a kind of critique of the Fed, but also a review of the Fed's actions since roughly 2008. I think they do a pretty good job of looking at the historical record. I don't think they really kind of flesh out their criticism particularly well, and I don't think they don't delve too much into the logic behind the Fed's decisions over the past 10 years. They've mostly just focused on the consequences. But the actual underlying rationale they kind of overlook a little bit, which I thought was a flaw. But if you're interested in just kind of getting a broad general view of what the Fed's been up to since 2008 and some of the better criticisms of that effort, then I would definitely recommend this episode of Frontline. Again, it's called Age of Easy Money, and you could just easily Google it and find it on YouTube. Just Age of Easy Money Frontline, you'll find it. I was actually going to send you a link a couple days ago after I watched it, but then I think you were offline or busy or something. I never know when to send you stuff because I don't want to interrupt your streaming.
That's a good question. All of my stuff is muted, so you won't bother me by messaging me in the sense that it won't like interrupt a show or like beep at me or whatever. I really don't like sound notifications, so even on my phone, like the only people who can make my phone make a noise are my family and my girlfriend. For everything else, it's vibrate, and I don't even have like push notifications for Discord or anything. So feel free to message me whenever. It's all good. If I don't get back to you, that's fine. I just have my status to busy because I don't know. I'm kind of a hermit, and I like being left alone. And when you have the busy, when you have the busy icon, you're less likely to be bothered about random shit.
There you go.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I send it to you now. It's in there in Discord.
Cool. And that goes for you too, chat. If you want to contact me about something, that's fine. You're not necessarily entitled to a response in any time frame. Sometimes I also lose stuff in the abyss of just I get that many messages.
Yeah, what was that Iraq episode called?
It's on my phone. I can check it when I'm not getting all in by Terran.
No, take your time. No hurry. Let's see. Oh, there's a whole bunch of them on here. Return from ISIS, returning from the Iraq War with PTSD, losing Iraq, Once Upon a Time in Iraq.
That's that one.
Once Upon a Time in Iraq.
Yeah, that's that one. Mm-hmm.
Gotcha. Okay, I'll cue that up for later. That should be interesting. Yeah, for those of you from outside the United States, Frontline is a documentary series that's produced by PBS, which is a partially government-funded public television network. They kind of fancy themselves like a public network funded by the government, but it's only like the funding they get from the government is only like 10% of revenue. which is not that much. It's enough for people to freak out whenever anybody suggests that the government stop funding them. That's always a big shitstorm. Yeah, lots of people like PBS. Occasionally, generally, I think it's the GOP. Yeah, it's pretty much always the GOP. Generally, a Republican politician will be the one that maybe suggests, like, hey, the government doesn't really need to be involved in this. This is kind of interventionism in the economy. We should just let PBS. We should cut PBS off from federal funding. It's not necessary. And then invariably, there's like a whole media hate campaign. Just letters and phone calls and just people calling in, just saying, no, we don't want you to cut funding to PBS. It's the only good thing on network television, etc. So there's almost invariably strong pushback to that. Yeah, that's kind of a running issue in American politics that pops up from time to time. But PBS in general is pretty respected. And Frontline is one of their flagship programs. And they've been doing documentaries for like 30 years. I want to say 30 to 40 years or so. Because I think they've got some episodes going back to the late 70s, thereabouts, something around that time frame, but a long time. And they generally produce pretty high quality stuff. Sometimes it's biased, they're not without their predilections. And in general, the Republican Party doesn't cooperate with them at all. Basically, whenever they try to interview somebody from the GOP, it's pretty rare for them to say yes. So invariably, most of the people that get interviewed in Frontline documentaries are disproportionately either left-wing politicians or left-wing activists. In general, they're much, much more accessible for Frontline than Republican or conservative equivalents.
Why?
I mean, what's the incentive? I mean, probably, whatever Frontline is looking at is going to be something that's of interest to the upper urban middle class in America, which tends to hew more liberal and left-wing. And so that's generally not going to be something conservatives are that interested in, or maybe is even something that doesn't reflect well on them. Especially if it's like a conservative government in power, probably they're asking a lot of uncomfortable questions. So, the Bush administration, for example, during the Iraq War was not very open, to interviews from PBS journalists or from Frontline documentarians.
Yeah, there's also a factor, too, that might be at play. The different platforms of information have different demographics of the viewers there.
Yeah, that's the other big factor.
Yeah, I'm thinking people who watch documentaries are more likely to be educated because they're usually more dry. They don't really have as much of a compelling story as something that's like a fictional narrative. They can have a really compelling story for sure, but you're dealing with regular people. Not everyone's super pretty in documentaries, but in like movies and TV shows and stuff like that, you can control for that and have everyone look a certain way, but documentaries are a lot more raw, regular people.
Yeah, exactly. So, there's no incentive as a politician to kind of participate in a documentary that nobody's going to watch, really.
Yeah.
So why bother in the first place? Best case scenario, nothing happens. Worst case scenario, maybe you say something stupid and then you take a political hit. With no discernible upside to kind of balance it. So, why? No reason to do it in that sense. But beyond that, there's also a partisan incentive. In general, PBS's viewership hews towards the left. It has, way more left-wing viewers than right-wing viewers. There are some, like right-wing viewers, but in general, it's kind of perceived, especially in conservative circles, as being more of a left-wing media outlet. And in that sense, if you're a conservative politician and you do agree to appear there, virtually nobody who's going to vote for you is going to actually watch that. So there's no upside in that sense either.
Yeah, the only upside I can think of is maybe you catch a few more moderate votes.
Yeah. Yeah, if you're a centrist, it's more attractive. And probably relatively more of the conservatives who do appear on Frontline are probably more of the centrist variety. I think, really the only time I can remember the Bush administration coming onto Frontline, or that is to say, Bush administration officials agreeing to be interviewed by one Frontline. Generally, they only did that when there was something that they were really trying to sell, or when they were trying to do damage control from something. But beyond that, I don't think they generally just did it casually. I don't think they ever just took casual interviews from Frontline unless they thought that there was something they could really get out of it, which was pretty rare, I think. But anyway, to bring this full circle, for those of you from outside the United States, if you want a good documentary series with some bias, but overall good quality about the United States and American political issues, Frontline is definitely a high recommendation.
I've seen a few of theirs. It's more, I would say, dry and straightforward than something like Vice.
Oh, yeah.
Vice, they try to spice it up a lot.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, Vice used to be known for that back in the day. I don't think they really still do it, though. They used to, their trademark used to be on the ground reporting, like in really volatile countries or wars or what have you. Like they would actually have people on the ground doing like regular reporting. I think what's his name, Simon something or other, was their correspondent for 2014, when Russia attacked Ukraine back then. And he did a lot of really good stuff. Like he did wild shit. It was like it was always really interesting to watch his videos back in 2014, 2015 when all that was playing out. So Vice like was very good at that. But then they kind of moved away from it. They didn't do it like nearly so much. I think they basically stopped doing it for a while. I think their kind of move was to try to become more of a normal news outlet. And the result is that the quality of the content kind of shifted. I mean, it was decent quality, but really the character of the content really changed dramatically. And I kind of think that kind of hurt them more than it helped them. I think they probably would have been better served sticking with their trademark news coverage, such as it was. Yeah, I think part of it is they just wanted to be taken more seriously. Because in addition to on-the-ground reporting and like really volatile parts of the world, they also did like a lot of weird shit. Just having people like hang out with weird people and do other just weird stories.
Yeah, talking
like
about psychedelics and stuff that it's not really active news. Well, it sort of is. It's like doing stuff that other people won't do for one reason or another, and they wouldn't really care what it was.
Yeah. I think they wanted to kind of get away from that. And so the shift in the business model, the overall shift in the business model reflected that. But I think it was overall a negative change for them, personally. That's my judgment. I can't really say whether or not they made more money afterwards, and that's the more important factor from the business perspective. But I do think we really lost something unique when they made that shift. Yeah, I remember one of the videos that I liked, that I can remember off the top of my head, was one guy, again, younger dude. They had generally younger correspondents. They had a guy who had heard about North Korean slaves being used to work in Far Eastern Russia. And he just went there. He just went out to like these really isolated parts of Siberia in the Russian Far East, and he just tried to find them. He's like, I'm just going to go find the North Korean slaves. And so he just started asking people about them and just trying to track them down. And he ended up making friends with like this weird Russian redneck guy and some of his friends, and they just kind of hung out and got drunk and got into like these little adventures. It was a very unusual, unorthodox approach to journalism, but it was also like a lot of fun to watch. He made it interesting and fun while not really losing the substance of the video. He actually did eventually find a work camp with North Korean workers in them. So it wasn't like it was for nothing. And, they were able to like talk to some of the people there. They didn't get much out of them. I think for the most part, they just wanted them to like leave. They just kept telling them no comment as expected. But the fact that he got any footage of it at all was pretty impressive to me. So I kind of miss that. I do miss that aspect of Vice News. If they still do stuff like that, somebody let me know, because I'd be interested. I miss the good old days. I'm nostalgic, so to speak.
There was one of a guy who went to North Korea, and that was another Vice documentary that I watched. I think this was back when we were living in Canada.
I think that's right.
Yeah, I remember being really kind of awakened to that overall issue and pretty upset for the North Korean people of how they're pretty stuck in their situation. It's really hard to protest or do much about the situation at all
Yeah.
whenever information is controlled so tightly and the government's so oppressive and that kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah, they did some good stuff there on that count. Yeah, still a very difficult place to live. Yeah, there may actually be an ongoing famine there right now. So it's actually even worse than usual at the moment, in so much as that's accurate. Let's see. I guess I'll get to some of these. How are we doing on time?
We can go for another 30 to 40.
30 to 40. Okay. Let's see. Oh, Dagnip. That's always good to hear from Dagnip. Is there any update regarding the ongoing protests in Peru? None that I'm aware of. I haven't read anything about or from Peru, I think, in probably more than a month. So that doesn't mean nothing's happening, but nothing in my news sources has really published anything updating me on it. So I would infer that there is some kind of status quo equilibrium there at the moment. Yeah, last I checked, there were big protests that were escalating in scale against the government after the removal / coup, however you want to frame that, of President Castillo. But since then, I haven't heard of any new escalations, or at least if there have been escalations, the news doesn't really consider them worth reporting anymore. Unrest in Peru has been a pretty long-running story at this point, for several years now. So I can't entirely blame mainstream news outlets for kind of overlooking it at this point. Peru is the kind of place where if things are calm, that would be news. That would be a change worth reporting on. But yeah, as far as I know, there's nothing new going on. As far as I know, people in the rural areas, especially the highlands, where the indigenous population is more located, they're still pretty upset about it, and I think they're still protesting. Maybe it's died down a bit, but I think they're still going. And there have been anyway, protests in the capital, Lima. But I haven't heard anything new on that count. But yeah, that last I checked, there were protests in those regions, and the rest of the country was more favorable, shall we say, to the removal of Castillo. So there was some of the standoff there. But I don't think it's been resolved one way or the other. I think they're just sort of stuck at the moment. So basically, I don't know. That's short answer. I don't know. I don't know what's going on there right now. I haven't heard anything new. Not the most satisfying answer, but that's the truth. Let's see. Did the Republicans' bill to let unvaxxed people into the U.S. again pass? I don't remember a bill being proposed in that vein. I do remember a lot of talk about Title 42. That could be what this person is thinking of. So that had been a rule that basically allowed the government to very quickly deport people who had entered the United States illegally. Undocumented migrants, if you like. And, the rule had originally been implemented by the Trump administration as it depends on how you kind of want to frame it. But the excuse at the time was that they wanted to try to prevent people with COVID from entering the country and spreading it and making the pandemic worse. But it also had the dual purpose of mitigating immigration, which of course was one of the Trump administration's mandates. And the Biden administration has since basically continued that, not so much to prevent the spread of COVID, even if that's the legal justification, but more so to try to serve as a tool in order to mitigate the big influx of people trying to get into the country, either seeking asylum or just seeking work. That's another framing question. Really, it's both, but the Biden administration knows that big influxes of immigrants of whatever kind is not popular, especially amongst conservatives, and he wants to try to mitigate any potential advantage that the Republican Party can glean from that by trying to take token efforts here and there to mitigate immigration, especially illegal immigration. And Title 42 and the propagation of Title 42, even after the pandemic had basically ended, was one of the ways that the Biden administration has tried to do that. So there had been talk about ending Title 42, although interestingly, it was not the Biden administration that did that. It was actually, I think, a lawsuit or something that somebody had filed demanding that it be ended. That it was that the order was illegal at this point and needed to be ended. And so the Biden administration fought against that, and I think they lost that. And so it was looking for a time like they might actually have to end it. I think it may even be that the court actually ordered them to stop as part of like an injunction. But since then, they've actually implemented it again, or at least they've set the foundation to start implementing Title 42 again. So they may actually start deporting people again under that rule, even though it's basically obsolete. So if that's what you're talking about, then yes, they are going to start doing that soon if they aren't doing it already. But if there is actually like a Republican bill that people have been debating in Washington that relates to this issue, then I don't know about it. I haven't heard anything about that.
Someone who wanted to congratulate you on giving great insight on Asia and China on the Joe Rogan podcast.
I should be so lucky. And we would get so much more exposure.
Yep.
On JRE.
The Joe Rogan experience.
Yeah, you would do well in particular, because you're kind of more his kind of guy in a lot of ways. You're fit, take care of yourself, self-sufficient. May not agree on politics on a lot of stuff, but in general, just being self-sufficient and physically fit, I think, would appeal to him in a lot of ways.
Yeah, Kukio would be able to box with him. I think they'd have a really funny conversation. I was talking with Trisha about how Kukio would deal with other smart people in a really interesting way. I would describe it as like intellectual judo, where a lot of smart kids, like people who are maybe, let's say top 5 percentile of just raw cognitive firepower, a lot of people like that. They really desperately want to be the smartest person in the room. And anytime there's another smart person, they kind of get a fire under their butt of, okay, I'm going to beat them in a debate, or I'm going to show them that I'm actually really smart. And the way that Kukio would talk to them would leave them extremely unsatisfied and also make him look like he was smarter, just because they would get so frustrated at wanting to beat him. And he would turn it around and just want to learn what they have to know, because that ultimately is the way to increase your knowledge, is to listen to other people, to hear their perspective, and to fill out more of your understanding of reality. So I thought that was a really great example that he set, where it's possible to be really smart, but not an egomaniac. You can be intelligent, but still learn from every single person, even people who maybe didn't score as high as you on a test. Like, they have a unique vantage point and perspective. And he would oftentimes leave people after a conversation feeling smarter and better about themselves, which is a really cool gift to give people.
Yeah, he was a top-notch dude.
Yeah.
But yeah, that is a very sort of proactive way of engaging with others. And it does require a great deal of presence of mind. You really have to be engaged with the conversation and understanding of where the other person is coming from and what they're trying to argue in order to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So props to him for pulling it off. I'm a little too scatterbrained to make it work a lot of the time.
Yeah, he was really good at having focus and trying to glean something useful from people, but not in a way that felt like he was trying to harvest information. It was more like you felt like the information that you had was valuable, so you feel good talking with him. We had a question from Juno about Xinjiang. There's a bunch of like propaganda videos and stuff of Uyghur women who are saying that there is no abuse or internment camps and stuff, which that seems kind of
oh yeah, I'm sure everything's fine. Everything is copacetic.
Why would they need to make those videos if there wasn't an issue there?
Yeah.
Have there been any updates from like outside journalists who look into the situation? Because we've heard some really nasty stuff. Oh, you laugh.
Yeah. I mean, outside journalists just can't get in. You know, they don't let them go. And so outside journalists can only really kind of report on the subject from a distance. And that inherently inhibits their ability to really investigate substantively.
They can't get in China, or they can't get in this province in particular?
They cannot get into the province specifically. Yeah, China does still let foreign journalists in, but it generally keeps a very close eye on them these days. They don't give them nearly as much free reign as they had even like 10 years ago, when they were kind of relatively more open. You know, now you definitely have like lots of handlers and whatnot following you around. But they only let you kind of run around in specific parts of the country. Like you're not getting into, say, Tibet or Xinjiang or what have you. That's kind of a no-go. So yeah, that makes it very difficult for outside journalists to kind of come in and really kind of try to find evidence that is sufficiently substantive to kind of really convince people solidly that, you know, the allegations about what the Chinese government is doing in Xinjiang are accurate. So yeah, there is no real reporting to speak of out of Xinjiang in that vein. You know, the only thing you're going to get is things like leaks of documents that are leaked out of the Chinese government. I mean, there's a big one, I think, like a year or two ago. So there was a lot of reporting about that. And then there's open source intelligence, which is stuff like, you know, satellite imagery, and also publicly released documents that the government may or may not have intended to be public. So, you know, stuff like that kind of allows you to paint a picture with publicly available information that does not prove the allegations about what's being done to the Uyghurs, but does build a pretty good case for it. But yeah, the Chinese government definitely has been going out of its way to create TikTok videos, YouTube videos, you know, whatever kind of content you can think of that tries to show Xinjiang and Uyghurs in a very positive light. And in order to downplay any allegations that they're anything but a happy minority working productively under the guidance of the wise Communist Party of China. They've also been letting in some, like, basically shills. You know, there's people on YouTube who make their money making content in China, but basically just at the direction of the Communist Party. So they'll actually be invited to go to Xinjiang, and then they'll be able to hang out with certain people, you know, Uyghurs generally, who have been selected for the purpose, and then they'll make a video about how actually people are very happy here, and look at the food, look at the architecture, you know, here's some people dancing, look, they're so happy. Otherwise, why would they be dancing if they weren't happy? You know, stuff like that.
Yeah. They do the same thing in the North Korea documentary, where you're pretty much on guided rails for your tour, and there's a minder that decides where you can and cannot go the whole time. And yeah, they do the same thing of they take you to a show that has a bunch of really amazing dancing and that kind of stuff to show you like the best side of their situation, but they don't really let you go to the areas. Like they would peek down alleyways and see people who looked like really dirty and poor and all this kind of stuff, but they won't let you like just go there and wander off to be with them all the time. So it sounds like a similar thing to that.
Yeah, exactly. It's the digital equivalent, if you like. So there's been a lot of that on YouTube, but, you know, mostly it's not hard to spot, really. You know, so I think most people just kind of ignore it. And yeah, the Chinese government has kind of struggled to really build a media presence. You know, they've been successful in producing a lot of content, but I don't think it's really all that compelling, at least not yet. I think they've had relatively more success in certain developing countries where they don't really have where there's not as much skepticism about China. And they've also been better at targeting like Chinese communities overseas. You know, so the cultural barrier there is not nearly so great, so they find it a little easier to influence them. Let's see. Well, we did have another question. Can you explain the Florida bill to ban the use of central bank digital currencies and what exactly that entails? Yeah, I saw the headline for this, but I haven't really read much about it. I didn't really think too much about it because I don't know that there's much that Florida as a state can do to stop central bank digital currencies one way or the other. Maybe they could refuse to accept them or recognize them. But in general, I think if the Fed does it, then that's pretty much the end of it. I don't think the state of Florida would be able to do much there would not be much that the state of Florida could tangibly do to stop it at that point. Yeah, I think it's mostly done for political theater because there has been some pushback against central bank digital currencies specifically, especially in conservative circles here in the United States. They're seen as basically using the technology of like blockchain, well, maybe not blockchain technology even, but basically kind of trying to emulate blockchain technology and cryptocurrency, but with a government role and control over the currency being maintained. So all of the worst things about normal currency, with maybe a few, well, basically none of the main advantages of cryptocurrency. That's not very attractive to a lot of people. And some critics have said it's basically just an excuse to try to expand the government's oversight and control over the economy, since digital currencies will be much easier for the government to keep track of, not just in terms of like where the money's going, but also in terms of how the money is being spent and who's holding it at a given time. Since all of that could hypothetically be tracked within the individual digital currency, like within individual units of the currency. Like they could just record where it had been spent, what it had been spent on, who was spending it, et cetera. So there's a lot more ambit for surveillance using a central bank digital currency. And so for that reason, some people have become very hostile to the prospect of central bank digital currencies. And so I kind of suspect Florida and DeSantis in particular is trying to capitalize on that. But I would have to read more to give you details specifically about what they're trying to do. Let's see, central bank digital currencies. Something for me to look at a little later. Yeah. Yeah, I just Googled it. I won't read it now, but even the little blurb that Google produced talks about concerns over surveillance and stifling of innovation. So pretty much what I would expect. Oh, somebody from Brazil asked a question. Let's see. Here in Brazil, people are always bringing Nicaragua to the debate because their current liberal president don't doom their dictatorship. Can you tell about what's going on that country? Yeah, that doesn't surprise me. Lula da Silva and Ortega definitely have a lot in common, at least in terms of ideology. Yeah, so Nicaragua. What's been going on in Nicaragua? I mean, how far back do you want to go? I mean, the current president is a guy named Ortega, and he's very old. How old is he exactly? Nicaragua president, he's got to be in his 80s by now at least. No, 77. Okay, I was off. All right. Credit to Ortega. He's younger than I thought. But 77 years old, that's not young, right? That's definitely older range of most leaders. And so the reason I bring up his age is that he was actually president of Nicaragua in the 1980s. And he was president of Nicaragua. He became president of Nicaragua after a revolution overthrew the government. And that was the culmination of a civil war that had raged throughout the 1970s. And the government, before the revolution succeeded, had been a US-supported authoritarian government that was referred to as the Sandinistas. The Somozas, that's what it was. Yeah, the Somoza family governed Nicaragua before the revolution. And they had taken control in the 1930s. I mean, again, how far back do you want to go? There was a guy named Somoza who had been the head of the National Guard, or the Civil Guard, or whatever. It was basically like an internal paramilitary organization that was purpose-built for internal security. And the institution was actually designed and created by the United States while the U.S. was occupying Nicaragua in the early 20th century. During an intervention, I think it was roughly a 20-year intervention. Nicaragua was having a civil war. It had a lot of warlords, and so the United States intervened to try to prop up the government and created this institution to try to serve as a Nicaraguan assistant, basically, for security operations being carried out by the United States Marine Corps. The guy that headed that organization later on basically seized control of the country in the 1930s. This was after the U.S. had left the country. He used the fact that he controlled what was effectively the principal military organization in Nicaragua to take control. And after he did, he basically placed everything in Nicaragua that was worth owning under the control of his own family. And so as a result, the Somoza family came to become the owners, effectively, of Nicaragua. They controlled the government. They controlled the commanding heights of the economy. They just owned it lock, stock, and barrel, effectively. So that pretty much gets you up to the 1970s. People obviously were upset about living in an authoritarian country where there was a lot of corruption and violence against dissenters. And so that spun into a revolution that encompassed not only communists, but also just people in the center, even maybe some people on the center right, that just were tired of having a bullshit, corrupt government. So that revolution was pretty broad-based. It took a while, I mean, about 10 years or so, but eventually it was able to succeed. The Somozas were overthrown. And then you get the Sandinistas, which was the coalition government. Again, it was kind of an umbrella movement. So they had a coalition of different political actors across the spectrum. And the coalition was referred to as the Sandinistas. They controlled the post-Somoza government. And the president that was chosen at that time was Ortega. Now, Ortega himself came from a more far-left background. The far left was probably the most important and largest part of that governing coalition. And that really rubbed the United States the wrong way. And you can probably guess why. It was the Cold War. The United States did not like left-wing governments, left-wing activists, generally in a lot of cases, and certainly did not like a revolutionary government overthrowing what had been a fairly reliable pro-American state in a region that the United States pretty much considered and still considers its de facto sphere of influence. So immediately, the U.S. government was very hostile to the Sandinista government and to President Ortega. And so after that, there was a lot of shenanigans. There was a civil war that spun out. This is a framing thing. People are going to argue about this forever, but the United States was definitely partly responsible for the Civil War. We backed what were called the Contras, who were anti-government rebels. Mostly they set up in the eastern part of the country in a region that used to be called the Mosquito Coast, but they also encompassed other regions, especially regions along the borders of states that were still led by pro-American governments, Honduras being the principal one, but also to a lesser degree El Salvador, which was experiencing its own civil war in the 1980s. Kind of Costa Rica too, but I think mostly Honduras was the main. Honduras has been a very reliable, American ally in the Central Asia for the better part of 100 years. So, they were especially a locus of American clandestine support to the Contras. But anyway, the United States definitely culpable, but then also Ortega also made some mistakes of his own, which is that he kind of leaned more towards the authoritarian side as far as governance. He did pretty good as far as building a coalition and trying to maintain it. But over time, some of the far left reforms that he tried to pass, as well as some of the ways that he dealt with dissent, rubbed people the wrong way. And the result is that he generated a legitimate opposition, a legitimate violent opposition. And so between the basically, CIA-supported mercenaries and the legitimate opposition in the country, a civil war sprung up that was at least partly the responsibility, can at least partly be attributed to some of the decisions made by President Ortega during this period. Now, regardless of how you want to frame it, being, illegitimate attempt by the United States to overthrow a legitimate government, or if it was a left-wing government that was overreaching and generating legitimate dissent that the United States just happened to be helping. However you want to frame that, Ortega had a bad taste in his mouth as far as the United States. He had lots of reasons to dislike Washington, given that they were actively trying to overthrow his government, and there was a lot of bad blood over that. Now, the Civil War lasted about 10 years, and then the result at the end of that was a peace agreement in which new elections were to be held. And the expectation was actually that Ortega would do pretty well, because he was still fairly popular, even after all of the things that had happened during the Civil War. But to everybody's surprise, including Washington's surprise, the conservative candidate actually won, center-right candidate. And so Ortega was actually out of power after that for, I think, around 10 years or so, pretty much through the 90s. He never left politics. He still campaigned and whatnot. But other actors kind of entered the field who were more charismatic, more popular, and he kind of just lost his luster a little bit. His thing had always been far left politics. That was just, again, where he came from. And that style of politics kind of lost its appeal after the collapse of the Soviet Union. There's kind of a big shift away from central planning and socialism and, liberation politics in general after 1991. And Ortega was definitely a loser from that. He definitely suffered a hit to his brand politically in the 1990s on that count. So what he did is in the early aughts, possibly even earlier in the late 90s, he started to shift his politics away from the left and towards what you might consider populism. It wasn't really like left-wing populism or even right-wing populism. It was just populism. Like, he came out before he had been a pretty stolid socialist in the sense that he wanted a secular state, legalize abortion, get the church out of the schools, all that kind of stuff. But then after he had his reform, late 90s, early aughts, suddenly he found Jesus. He wasn't like a hardcore Christian. But he recognized that there was a lot of socially conservative policies that were just genuinely popular with the population. And during this transformation, he started to embrace those rather than fight them. He still embraced a lot of left-wing economic policies. That never really went away. But in terms of social policy, he became much more of a populist. He stopped trying to swim upstream, in other words. And that worked. In the early mid-aughts or so, he was able to win the presidency back and re-enter power. And he's pretty much been there ever since. He's won every election since then. He was genuinely popular for a long time. He was part of that Chavista wave that went over Latin America over the course of the aughts. And, even after the commodities bust kind of hurt the region, he was still able to maintain his popularity. There was a countervailing blue wave in Latin America over the course of the 2010s in which conservative governments were able to win back office and kind of push out a lot of the left-leaning governments in the region, although the more authoritarian Chavista governments largely kind of stayed in place. But, Ortega was legitimately popular. He didn't really need to engage in a lot of, suppression in order to kind of keep winning elections. And so he was able to stay in office for whatever it was, 10, 15 years without incident. But then what happened was, in 2019, which, as many of you may remember, was a year of protests among many parts of the world, there was an election that was upcoming, and Ortega's popularity had started to slip. He had been in power long enough that he had built up what was in effect a corrupt patronage network, which is very common in a lot of developing countries, But at that point, it was very clear that that his party and his coalition was to varying degrees engaged in corruption. And also, the economy was not doing great. Nicaragua has, I think, been historically the poorest country in Central America, if memory serves. And while Ortega had implemented a lot of welfare programs and whatnot to try to mitigate that, overall economic growth was not great. So in general, people were getting tired of him. There were enough people who were tired of him that there got to be a pretty decent-sized protest movement that cropped up that was asking basically for him to step down because they didn't really trust him to actually run an honest election. He had been popular enough to win elections without incident before, but having been in power so long and having built up what was an increasingly centralized government under his control, there was a lot of doubt amongst dissenters that he would actually allow an election in which he could feasibly lose. And as those protests started up, the government started to crack down more and more violently as time went on. And eventually the protest movement was successfully crushed, but the government kind of tipped its hand as to its true nature during the subsequent election, in which they did not, in fact, allow a free and fair election. There was no substantive dissenting candidate that was allowed to run. In fact, I think the main opposition candidate that was running against him was actually arrested not long before the election, if I'm remembering correctly. If chat knows differently, please do correct me, but I think that was the case. And after that, it was pretty much obvious that he was running an authoritarian government. It was not as bad an authoritarian government as, say, Venezuela. Certainly, it was not like North Korea or anything like that, but it was what you might call, it very much was on the border between an authoritarian country and an illiberal democracy, as they say. So, he does still have a lot of support, but he's leaned increasingly on authoritarian methodology to maintain his hold on power, to the point where you cannot really say that Nicaragua's government is any longer truly representative. So that's like as quick as I can make it, like snapshot of Nicaragua and where they've been over the past half century plus or so. So the reason that, this person, the questioner, would know better than me, since they're actually from Brazil, and I haven't been following Brazilian politics too much since Lula da Silva won the presidency. But the reason I'm not surprised that Nicaragua might be a talking point is because Ortega has a lot in common with Lula da Silva politically. Lula da Silva also embraces a lot of left-wing economic policies. And as I recall, he's also kind of shifted more towards the center on a lot of social issues as well. Correct me if I'm wrong on that, but I believe he's done that in order to try to build more political support. So that's analogous to what Ortega did in Nicaragua. But it's also worth mentioning, too, that I think they're of similar age. So they're kind of a similar generation. Let me check that. No, not. There's a lot of De Silvas in Brazil. I'm going to have to be more specific. Same age, yeah, 77. They're both 77. So they both come from a generation of left-wing activists that kind of came up and entered politics in a period where doing so was very difficult. Nicaragua was having its civil war in the 70s, and then Brazil, I believe, still had its military government, which had seized power in 1964, I think. So, there was a lot of oppression targeting left-wing activists at that time in Latin America, certainly in Brazil and Nicaragua in particular at the time, given the context. And so they were, I don't want to say they were like radicalized, but that definitely had a clear impact on their politics. Like there's a certain style of left-wing liberation politics that is heavily focused on economic socialism, economic left-wing policies of one kind or another, and to a lesser degree, left-wing social policies, but which is heavily critical of the United States, heavily critical of capitalism, and heavily critical of right-wing authoritarianism specifically. And that style of Latin American left-wing politics very much lives on in the form of these guys, De Silva and Ortega, like in their rhetoric, in their campaign platform, in their predilections, in their suspicion of the United States, in their inclination to kind of give Moscow the benefit of the doubt, even if they're not willing to quite say it explicitly, they're generally more pro-Russian. All of that is a legacy of 70s style politics, specifically 70s style socialist politics in Latin America. So the fact that they're being compared or talked about in the same breath, no surprise. It makes total sense. If to give you an example of that, I think Nicaragua is one of the few countries that actually voted not to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine at the UN. Even countries that are not really all that skeptical about Russia's claims over Ukraine, or even just apathetic, most countries either abstained or voted to condemn it. But just a very small few actually voted not to condemn it, just very specifically a no vote. And Nicaragua was one of those. And they didn't really have any reason to do that. It's not as though Russia like gives them a lot of aid or is a major trade partner or sells them a lot of weapons or, whatever. Like the only reason to do that is ideological that I can think of. Maybe you could argue they were trying to signal to Russia that they wanted some stuff and that they wanted a stronger relationship, but I doubt it. Like, I really think that was just done purely out of skepticism for the United States and the West and NATO. And I think that can be attributed largely to ideological considerations on Ortega's part. So yeah, long story short, 1970s redux. Now, I would point out that I don't entirely know just what the context is in which Nicaragua is being mentioned in these debates that the questioner mentions. So without that information, I can't really be more specific than that. So that's the best answer I can give, given what I know about it. But hopefully that's all-encompassing enough of an answer to cover most of the bases. If not, if I missed the gist of a question, please feel free to ask it again. I'm happy to return to it. I've missed, I've missed the gist of questions before. So it's not as though it's unprecedented. How are we doing? 12:16, is that, how much time did that take up?
Got like 10 minutes.
10 minutes, okay.
Yeah.
I guess we could skip to some of the weird stuff.
Yeah.
You ever seen a Chinese mine collapse?
No.
I'll send that to you. There's a big collapse, I think, in northern China. And it was an open pit mine, which is why it was unusual, but it was a huge, huge mine. And when it collapsed, like, the amount of earth that moved was just immense. Like, you can see the, the dump trucks they use in the mining, like the big giant ones that are the size of a house.
Yep.
Like, you could see those in the video, but they look tiny. Compared to like the collapse that occurred, like these things were just totally dwarfed. It's a wild video. That happened a while ago. It was a couple weeks. Let's see. There were some journalists that were targeted in Ecuador. They had some explosive devices, quote unquote, that were mailed to them. And I think there were several. 5 different organizations were sent the letters. And there was one guy that said the explosive device actually looked like a USB drive, which he plugged into his computer, whereupon it blew up.
Damn.
Yeah. So probably cartels, I think, is the guess. I don't think anybody else really has the incentive. There's been a lot more violence in Ecuador over the past 5 years or so. And generally, the government tries to explain it as being infiltration by cartels. Cartels are expanding their writ, basically, into Ecuador. And so along with their presence has grown corresponding violence. But that is pretty sophisticated, USB explosive devices. That kind of illustrates the sophistication that cartels can kind of bring to the table when they want to murder somebody.
Yeah, I'd never heard of that before.
Yeah, well, when you have shit tons of drug money to work with, you can kind of afford to be creative, I guess. Let's see, there's been bank drama, but I think that's kind of overblown. For the most part, like, the banking sector is kind of doing okay. I think the bigger problem for the Fed is more so contagion in the form of depositors losing confidence, but that's not something the Fed has tools that it can really use to effectively address that. Like, if the banks themselves are having some kind of structural problem, like with their balance sheet or something, the Fed can do something about that. But just public confidence in banks, that's not something they have anything that'll really affect. That they don't have anything that'll deal with that. So that's kind of where they are. That's what they've been struggling with. They've been trying to control their statements to the press in a way that kind of illustrates that they are taking action such that people can have confidence, but they also are trying to avoid moral hazard, etc. It's kind of a difficult line to toe. You don't want to bail anybody out more than you need to, but you also don't want to do nothing and just accidentally cause a cascade of bank failures, which I don't think anybody needs right now. I think that would be a lot more drama than anybody needs in their life at this juncture. So the Fed's kind of doing good on that count. But overall, I think the banking system is pretty robust. There was a lot of restrictions and capital requirements that were imposed in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis. So overall, most of the banking sector is pretty resilient to all of this. The bigger issue is that there's a kind of a cohort of banks that are mostly regional in nature, and they've always been more deregulated. But they were especially, they were always less regulated, but they especially became less regulated because of the deregulation that was passed in, 2017, I think, or maybe 2018. It was the Trump administration, back in the period when the GOP had both houses of Congress and the presidency. So they passed that, and regional banks were able to kind of run with that for a while, but eventually, the risk-taking caught up to them, and we've got the current circumstances to show for it. But, it was always expected that cohort of risk-seeking banks was going to encounter problems sooner or later, given the amount of risk they were taking on. But it wasn't considered too much of a problem because that was a relatively narrow slice of the overall financial system. So, even if they just tanked, it was unlikely that they were going to take the rest of the banking system with them. Again, the bigger issue is depositors. The depositors are kind of feeling a little iffy. They're feeling a little paranoid. And so the response then is to pull their money out of a lot of banks and stick them into bigger banks, or maybe just put the cash into their mattress or whatever. There's more perceived risk in the financial system, and that's having deleterious effects on balance sheets. And so that's kind of more what the Fed is trying to deal with, and that has been the bigger issue from the start. I presume that the contagion will be contained, just because sooner or later something else is going to enter the news cycle. Something else is going to get people's attention, and then depositors will be less flighty at that point, I would guess. And also, sooner or later, news about the banks will kind of filter out. There's been some pretty big efforts to bail out some of the European ones. I've been a little surprised by that. Credit Suisse is kind of the main example, but I think there's been some others that are really dipping into some of those emergency support funds that the European Central Bank and the Federal Reserve have set up. But I haven't seen too much evidence, or at least too much concern, that the banks are just going to outright go under. So again, it is more about the depositors. So we'll see. I mean, I don't know exactly what's going to happen, but I think my impression overall is that the financial system can absorb this, and that this will probably, knock on wood, be a temporary thing. What else? Finland is probably going to join NATO ahead of Sweden. Did we talk about that?
Yes, I think that's due to
We did?
Erdogan.
Okay. Yeah.
Not today, but we've talked about it in the past, yeah.
Okay.
Oh, speaking of Finland, I saw a trailer for a movie before I watched John Wick. It's about World War II occupied Finland, and there's a guy who's apparently, like, I don't know if he was a part of the Finnish military, but he's just a gold miner or something, and it's like the standard trope of they killed his family and now he's gonna get revenge. But it's cool that it's a location and time period that I haven't really seen much of. So World War II, German occupied Finland, and it's kind of like a Tarantino movie almost, and it's very action oriented.
I'm a little suspect about that, because Finland was not occupied by Germany during the war.
I don't know if occupied is the right term, but there were Nazis in Finland, no?
Yeah, they were allied. Finland was an allied government of Germany at the time.
Huh.
And They actually invaded the Soviet Union with Germany as an allied state. In fact, Finland is a weird example because most of the allied states Germany invaded with were actually authoritarian Nazi satellite states that were kind of in the German sphere of influence. Finland actually was, at the time, I believe, a democracy. And their reason for aligning with the Germans was not because they were Nazis and wanted to destroy the Soviet Union for the sake of Lebensraum. They were basically just trying to get the land back that they'd lost in the Winter War in 1940, when the Soviet Union had invaded them. So that was a unusual arrangement. And the Finns themselves actually kind of restricted their support to the war effort to recovering the lands that they had lost. Once they'd retrieved territories lost to the Soviets in the Winter War, they actually, for the most part, stopped advancing, much to the frustration of the Germans. They didn't like that. There also wasn't much they could do about it. But beyond that, yeah, I mean, they were on the same side. And it wasn't until the end of the war that they ended up de facto dropping out. I don't think they ever switched sides per se, but I think they did just kind of stop fighting. And at that point, the Germans were pushed out of the country. They were required to leave or whatever. The Germans were, I think, willing to leave because they needed troops elsewhere. And there wasn't any point in fighting to the last man for, Finland. Wasn't going to get them anything. But yeah, is it a zombie movie?
No. Okay, so I'm just reading the storyline here. During the last desperate days of World War II, a solitary prospector crosses paths with Nazis on a scorched earth retreat in northern Finland.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, so they're retreating through Finland at the end of the war, it looks like. The Nazis steal his gold, and then it turns out that he's a badass, and then it's fighting stuff happens.
Gotcha, okay. That makes more sense.
Yeah. Yeah, it wasn't explained in the trailer, what they were doing there, so I was just guessing.
Gotcha. Yeah, I recall there was actually a Scandinavian movie about Nazi zombies at one point, which is why I thought of it. So, different movie, sorry.
It's called Sisu 2020.
Sisu, okay.
Yeah, which means just stubborn survival and toughness, not really strength. I linked it to you in Discord. It's pretty new, I think.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, the Finns are pretty good at that.
Yeah, their territory location is also good for it as well.
Yeah, they've got favorable terrain. Let's see. I know we don't have much time left, but I was looking at flags and I noticed there was somebody in chat asking about World War III. Is World War III currently happening, or what's the situation there? I don't think it's happening. Just because there's a conflict in Europe doesn't mean the whole world is on fire. Most parts of the world actually, again, like I said at the beginning, most parts of the world don't really care that much about Ukraine. So the idea of that being indicative of a global conflict is outlandish to most people. But, there definitely is an uptick in conflict around the world, especially in Africa. I've been trying to follow that a little bit more, and I was surprised by just how extensive it's gotten, especially in the Sahel. We've talked about the Sahel before, right? Yeah. So Burkina Faso is one of the countries in the Sahel, and what I was reading is that 40% of its territory is currently controlled by rebels of one kind or another, which is very high. I had not realized it had gotten that bad. But Mali is also having trouble in the same vein, and to a lesser degree, Niger and Chad as well. Northern Nigeria is also getting hit very hard. So, the whole Sahel region right now is just on fire. The amount of bandit activity, Islamist activity, rebel activity of one sort or another, all of it is quite extensive at this point. It's been growing over time, but it's reaching critical levels now. But that's not really part and parcel of a global conflict. That's just regionalized conflict, I guess. But if you want something like World War III, you would really need to get a lot more countries involved. Obviously there's tension between the United States and China, but I think there's limited interest on the part of either Washington or Beijing of a significant confrontation right now. I think both parties are pretty busy with other stuff. And even if there were a confrontation between China and the United States, I don't know like how much of the world would really want to get involved with that. I mean, you can say something like India, right? India has border dispute with China, but just because China picks a fight with the United States doesn't mean India is immediately going to like try to invade disputed territory along its border with China. They don't get anything out of that. If anything, they would prefer that the border disputes remain just a frozen conflict that they don't have to think about. It's not really like a major strategic issue for India. It's really more of a political issue, since any government that is not seen to be strong enough on the border dispute issue is going to be accused of being weak on national security. And of course, that's politically damaging for any government. So they prefer to keep it out of the spotlight for the most part. In so much as it enters the spotlight, they generally take strong action, but mostly it's just theater. We saw that with the fighting, the hand-to-hand fighting that was happening in the Himalayas a couple of years ago in 2020 when the border dispute flared up. So India is not going to jump into a conflict with China just, because the United States asks them nicely or on their own initiative. It's not something they're going to want to do. So, and I think you can say the same for most countries around the world. Most countries do not want to have to choose between the United States and China. They make money trading with both. From the perspective of the developing world, current circumstances are preferred. Ideal circumstances are more what it was like in the aughts when there was kind of an open trading regime and there was no protectionism and whatnot. That's their ideal circumstance, but that's obviously not really on the table at this point. So status quo is preferable to a prospective conflict. So that's what they're kind of pushing for. Now, that said, while the prospects for any kind of actual global conflict are very low, I think there's a better argument to be made for something like a global civil war, which I was kind of thinking about a couple weeks ago. There is kind of a clear-cut shift, in global politics between, well, in terms of globalists and cosmopolitan, well, that's the same thing. Globalists and nationalists, let's say. There are people who are kind of part of a international culture that is economically and to a lesser degree politically intertwined. And those people have a vested interest in the status quo, specifically in the system of international governance and trade as created after World War II. But in opposition to them, there is this increasingly powerful nationalist movement that differs from country to country, but in general, they're unified by a general distaste for that same international order that globalists prefer. So again, the division between these two groups varies considerably in character and composition from country to country. So there's not a whole lot that's consistent between them other than that just general connection and perception of internationalism. But in so much as that continues to generate political friction, it is possible over time that there is a broader kind of nationalist uprising against the collective internationalism of the current status quo. And if that happens in enough countries around the world at roughly the same time, you could end up with something that you could hypothetically characterize as something resembling a global civil war. And that would be very different than like an actual world war. It wouldn't be like countries invading other countries or trying to conquer and annex other countries or subjugate them and whatnot. But it's worth thinking about because a global civil war of that nature could end up being just as destructive as an actual world war. Not a nuclear world war. World War III, if it happened, would probably go nuclear and then just everybody dies and it's a moot point. But if you're comparing to like World War II or World War I, a global civil war could be similarly destructive compared to those conflicts. Civil wars are very frequently unrestrained, like there are no rules, and it's not unusual for them to bring in outside powers. So a cascading series of civil wars in which governments connected or otherwise supported by the international order are delegitimized and have to fight for their survival, on a broad enough scale that could end up being as destructive as a world war and potentially as impactful. So that's probably more likely than World War III at this point.
The way that you described it just makes me think of a super Brexit.
Yeah, well,
because it's the
pretty much.
same sentiment of nationalism versus globalism, because the remain in the EU, like the EU is not a global entity, but it is a multinational entity and represents compromise and shared burdens and a lot of sentiments that nationalists really don't like, because they feel like nationalists have to pay out to other people that they don't know, and their money is bleeding to those people. When if you're a nationalist, you believe in your country, you believe that your country is going to be successful if they just focus on themselves. But yeah, you're talking about how every country has that sort of process of determining what their stance is on that, but no country is ever 100% in one camp or the other. And a lot of countries right now are pretty split down the middle in terms of whether they think that we should go more in the globalist direction or more in the nationalist direction.
Yeah, there's considerable consternation over that, especially amongst nationalists who feel like economic development and integration with international trade results in significant changes to their native cultures that they feel is a threat to their traditions.
Mm-hmm.
And so from their perspective, they would prefer there to be more limits in terms of economic trade and integration, such that they would find it a little easier to manage the changes that are inflicted on cultures by economic development.
Mm-hmm. And we do have some factors that are going against another all-out world war that weren't the case back in World War II. The population is now a lot higher. The quality of life is also higher. And we've also just generated more stuff, more infrastructure, more technology. So it feels like we have more to lose by choosing violence against one another than we did in the past.
Very much so. Very much so.
They couldn't browse the internet back in World War II.
True. But it's never been a barrier in the past. Like, you don't need a majority of a population to participate in violent conflict in order to initiate a civil war or a violent conflict generally. You only need a minority. You know, it doesn't take very many people to be violent shitheads to basically destroy stability in a society. It's a very delicate equilibrium, stability. So it's something to bear in mind. Probably we can avoid it, but you know, if something dramatic happens, like if climate change is like as bad or worse than predicted, or if there's a major economic externality, you know, negative externality that negatively impacts the global economy, that could really inhibit government's ability to try to maintain their legitimacy.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, any number of things could happen, and probably what's going to happen is multiple things happening at once. That's what some people are calling polycrisis. So that could cumulatively, you know, different crises could cumulatively put enough pressure on governments around the world that they just can't hang on, and you end up with just internecine conflict for some period of time, while some new equilibrium is reached.
Well, best of luck to us.
Yeah. Yeah, we'll see what happens. We'll see what happens.
Never.
Hopefully we can kind of stay ahead of things, but we'll see.
Yeah. Well, cool. Appreciate you breaking everything down for us this week. And chat, thank you as always for weighing in. And as a reminder, if you have any other comments or corrections you want to share, you can leave them in the YouTube comments. I'll try to upload this video right after the stream and have it go live before I go to bed. Thank you, Fuzzy Cold, for passing along questions, and Agent Smith for showing up and telling us about the world. At least
thank you for putting up with me. It's always a privilege.
Heck yeah, it's a fun time. Freshens up my day for sure. Well, cool. I won't be available for a session next week, but I should be good after that. Yeah, so next Sunday. Free day. If you want to go run a 5K or something during our time slot, that's fine.
I would probably hurt myself doing that. But I could probably walk. That much is. I did walk this past week, actually today.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, so challenge met in that regard.
Okay, well then I'm gonna up it 25-minute walk this week.
Oh, shit.
Oh, shit.
Gonna make me do 4 rounds around the neighborhood.
Yep. Just try to check the weather before you go out.
Yeah, really. I'll make an effort. Don't want to get blown away by 80-mile gusts or rained out by some torrent.
Oh my gosh, we had an adorable Twitch viewer who, in the innocence of their non-American eyes, they were like, I heard Texas was really nice and sunny all year. And I was like, oh, sweet summer child. Nice and sunny all year. Hellishly hot, brutally windy, buckets of rain, random snow in places where it shouldn't exist. Texas weather.
Oh, yeah, don't forget about the Arctic fronts.
Yeah.
That seems to be getting more normal these
Polar
days.
vortex.
Polar vortex. God,
Yeah.
that was bad.
Well, you take
That
care
was
of
bad.
yourself, sir.
Yeah, you too. You too. Thank you very much.
We appreciate you all, and we'll see you on the next episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Yeah. Yes, sir. See you next time. Thanks again.
GG. Nice.